Nathaniel Caldwell burned her letters without reading a single word. All 6 of them. One by one into the fireplace on the morning of his own wedding. He told himself he didn't need to know her. He told himself this was business. He told himself a man of his position didn't owe a bride conversation warmth or the simple decency of curiosity. He was wrong about every single thing, and he would spend the next 2 years paying for it in ways no fortune could fix. If this kind of story speaks to your heart, stories about pride consequence, and the kind of love that has to be earned, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The morning of his wedding. Nathaniel Caldwell stood at the window of his study and watched the carriages arriving below. Guests from 3 counties dressed in their finest, carrying the expectation that today would mark the beginning of something remarkable. He felt nothing close to remarkable. What he felt was the particular exhaustion of a man who had already decided how the day would go before it started. There was a ceremony. There was a reception. There was a woman he had agreed to marry because her family's money was the only thing standing between Caldwell Manor and total ruin. And then there was the rest of his life, which he intended to conduct exactly as he always had, with order, with discipline, and without the inconvenience of emotional entanglement. He turned from the window and looked at the fireplace. 6 letters sat on the mantel. Clara Whitmore had sent the first one 3 weeks after the engagement was announced. She had sent the last one 11 days ago. He knew this because Benjamin, his estate manager, had placed each one on his desk with that particular expression Benjamin wore when he disapproved of something, but was too loyal to say it aloud. Nathaniel had moved all 6 unopened to the mantel. He wasn't sure why he hadn't simply burned them when they arrived. Sentiment, perhaps. Or the vague notion that he might read them eventually, if time permitted. Time had not permitted. He picked up the first envelope. Clara Whitmore, written in careful, unhurried script. No flourishes. No urgency. Just a name written as though the person behind it had nothing to prove. He fed it to the fire. Then the second. Then the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth. He watched the paper curl and blacken and dissolve into ash, and he told himself this was the correct decision. He didn't need to know her thoughts on gardens or childhood memories, or whatever quiet women wrote in letters to strangers they were about to be bound to for life. He needed her family's liquidity. He needed her father's connections. He needed the marriage to proceed smoothly so that Caldwell Manor could survive another decade. That was the arrangement. That was all it was. "The carriage is ready, sir." He turned. Benjamin stood in the doorway, a man of 55, with a face like weathered oak, hard lines, honest eyes, and the particular stillness of someone who had witnessed too much to be easily surprised. "Thank you," Nathaniel said. Benjamin didn't move. "Was there something else?" "Only that I received a letter myself," Benjamin said, "from one of the Whitmore household staff. She mentioned that Miss Whitmore has been preparing for this day for quite some time. She described her as, and I believe these were the exact words, the steadiest person I have ever known." Nathaniel looked at him. "Steady is a fine quality in a plow horse," he said. "I'll be down in 5 minutes." Benjamin's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. He gave a short nod and withdrew. Nathaniel straightened his cravat. He was not a cruel man. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself. He was a practical man. There was a difference. He hadn't invented the circumstances that had brought Caldwell Manor to the edge of collapse. His father had done that slowly, over 20 years of poor investments and worse judgment. He hadn't chosen to need a wealthy wife. The ledger had made that choice for him. And he hadn't asked Clara Whitmore to develop expectations about what their marriage would look like. If she had written letters, that was her business. If she had hoped for something warmer than a business arrangement, she would simply have to adjust her expectations. I was not responsible for adjusting them for her. St. Andrew's Church sat at the center of Harrow County, a white-steepled building that had hosted 3 generations of Caldwell weddings, 2 Caldwell funerals, and 1 spectacular Caldwell bankruptcy proceeding that the congregation still discussed in lowered voices. Nathaniel arrived precisely on time. He walked up the center aisle with his cousin Edmund at his side, nodded to the families he recognized, and took his place at the altar. He did not feel nervous. He felt, if anything, slightly impatient. Then the doors opened. He had expected he realized this only afterward, when he had time to examine his own assumptions. He had expected a performance of some kind. A young woman in an expensive dress moving carefully under the weight of social scrutiny, perhaps clutching her bouquet too tightly, perhaps showing the trembling that most women showed when they walked into a room full of people who were evaluating them. Clara Whitmore did not tremble. She walked through those doors the way water moves through a valley, not forcing anything, not performing anything, simply going in the direction it naturally flows. Her dress was ivory with pale blue trim, simple in a way that managed to look deliberate rather than modest. Her hair was soft brown, pinned without excessive architecture, and her face was calm in a way that Nathaniel had not anticipated and could not immediately categorize. Not the calm of someone suppressing emotion. Not the calm of someone too sheltered to feel the full weight of the moment. Something else. Something quieter and more unsettling. The calm of someone who had already decided exactly who she was and had no particular interest in defending that decision to anyone in the room. The congregation had gone still, not the polite stillness of people observing a ceremony. The different stillness, the involuntary kind that falls over a room when something unexpected is happening and everyone instinctively stops to process it. Nathaniel stood at that altar, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't know what to do with his hands. She reached the altar. She looked at him directly, not deferentially, not boldly, simply directly, the way one person looks at another when they have decided honesty is less exhausting than theater. "Mr. Caldwell," she said quietly. "Miss Whitmore," he managed. The minister began speaking. Nathaniel heard approximately half of it. The other half of his attention was occupied with a sensation he hadn't felt since he was 19 years old and had made a serious miscalculation on a land deal and only recognized it after the papers were signed. The sensation of realizing too late that he had badly misunderstood something important. He had imagined a quiet woman. She was quiet. But quiet the way deep water is quiet, not because nothing is happening beneath the surface, but because what's happening beneath the surface has no need to advertise itself. He had imagined someone sheltered. Nothing about her suggested shelter. She suggested something more like bedrock, the kind of stability that doesn't come from never having been tested, but from having been tested and deciding to remain standing regardless. He said the words the minister prompted him to say. She said hers. The ring was exchanged. The congregation applauded with the satisfied warmth of people who had witnessed the correct conclusion to a long-anticipated event. Nathaniel Caldwell stood beside his new wife and felt for the first time in his adult life genuinely uncertain about whether he had done something wrong. The reception was held in the garden of the Whitmore estate, which Clara's father Charles had insisted upon and which Nathaniel had agreed to without particular feeling either way. It was a large garden, well-maintained, smelling of early summer and cut grass, and by the time the sun began its decline toward the tree line. Approximately 80 people were circulating through it with the industrious sociability of people who had been given excellent food and the implicit permission to discuss everything they'd witnessed that afternoon. Nathaniel stood near the east garden wall and watched his new wife. She was speaking with a group of older women, the kind of women who had been attending Virginia social gatherings since before Nathaniel was born, who knew everyone's family history and most of their financial situations, and who distributed approval and disapproval with the precision of surgical instruments. They were formidable. Nathaniel had watched more than one socially ambitious young woman wither under their collective attention. Clara was not withering. She was listening to Margaret Hartwell, who was 73, had outlived 3 husbands, and had opinions about everything with the complete attention of someone who genuinely found what Margaret Hartwell was saying interesting. When Margaret finished, Clara said something that made the entire group laugh. Not the polite, obligatory laughter of social performance, but the surprised, unguarded kind. Margaret Hartwell, who had not produced an unguarded laugh in at least a decade, in Nathaniel's experience, laughed that way. Nathaniel looked at his glass. "She does that everywhere she goes," said a voice beside him. He turned. Benjamin had materialized at his elbow with the quiet efficiency that made him indispensable. "Does what?" Nathaniel said. "Makes people feel like they've said something worth hearing." Benjamin's voice was neutral, informational. "I've watched her do it 4 times since we arrived. Different people, different conversations. Same result. She's sociable. She's attentive," Benjamin corrected mildly. "There's a difference. Sociable people talk. Attentive people listen. Miss Whitmore." Mrs. Caldwell listens as though she intends to remember what she hears. People notice that. They don't always know why they feel better after talking with her, but they do. Nathaniel watched her excuse herself from the older women and move toward a different cluster of guests. This one, including 2 men, he recognized as local farmers. Men who would not normally command attention at a social gathering of this kind, men who usually stood at the periphery waiting for the event to conclude. She went directly to them. Not because they were conveniently placed, not by accident. Deliberately, as though she had spotted them from across the garden and decided their conversation was the one she wanted to be part of. One of the men, Tom Reardon, who farmed the eastern quarter of Harrow County and had been struggling since the previous year's poor harvest, visibly relaxed the moment she began talking. Within 2 minutes, he was animated, gesturing, describing something with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. "What is she saying to them?" Nathaniel asked. "I don't know," Benjamin said. "But I'd wager she's asking about the crops. She has a particular interest in agricultural conditions. Her father's manager mentioned it to me months ago. Apparently she's been studying farming methods quite seriously for several years." Nathaniel looked at him. "She's a wealthy landowner's daughter." "Yes," Benjamin said. "Why would she study farming methods?" Benjamin was quiet for a moment. "I believe the answer she gave when asked that question was that understanding how the land works seemed more useful than not understanding it." He paused. She apparently found this self-evident. The party continued. The sun went down. The lanterns were lit. Nathaniel spoke with the people he was expected to speak with, said what he was expected to say, and performed the social obligations of a new husband with the competence he brought to every obligation. And all evening, without fully intending to, he watched his wife. The first 2 weeks of their marriage were conducted with careful civil distance. They shared meals. They exchanged the necessary communications of 2 people managing a household together. Clara asked sensible questions about the estate's daily routines and was given sensible answers. Nathaniel asked nothing about her routines because he had not until recently considered that her routines might be relevant to him. He reconsidered this on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week when Benjamin appeared in his study, looking slightly less composed than usual. "There's a situation," Benjamin said. Nathaniel set down his pen. "Define situation." "Mrs. Caldwell has been spending her mornings in the fields." Nathaniel waited. "With the workers," Benjamin continued. "She brings water. She asks questions. She has been going through the harvest records, the ones in the eastern storage room, the ones that haven't been touched in approximately 3 years, and she has been making notes." He paused. "She came to me yesterday with a question about the Harmon contract." The Harmon contract was a supply agreement Nathaniel had inherited from his father, one he had never found time to examine closely, because examining it closely had always seemed less urgent than the 40 other things demanding his attention. What question did she ask? She asked why we were paying Harmon 12% above market rate for seed stock that has declined in quality for 3 consecutive seasons, and whether we had considered that the contract contained a clause allowing renegotiation if quality standards were not met. Benjamin's expression was careful. "I did not have a satisfying answer for her." Nathaniel was quiet. "I looked at the contract this morning," Benjamin said. "She's correct, on both points. We've been overpaying Harmon by approximately $40 a season for 3 years, and we have the legal standing to renegotiate. No one had looked at it closely enough to notice." "She noticed," Nathaniel said. "In 2 weeks," Benjamin said, "while also learning the names of every person working on this estate and the particulars of their family situations." He stopped. "She asked me, sir, with considerable politeness, whether you would prefer to handle the Harmon renegotiation yourself, or whether she should draft a letter to begin the conversation. She said she didn't want to overstep." Nathaniel sat back. The thing he felt in that moment was not the thing he would have predicted. It wasn't annoyance, though he searched for it. It wasn't the mild condescension he might have expected to feel toward a young woman playing at estate management in her first weeks of marriage. What he felt was something closer to the feeling he'd had at the altar, that particular uncomfortable awareness of a miscalculation. "Tell her to draft the letter," he said, "and bring it to me before she sends it." Benjamin nodded and turned to go. "Benjamin." The man paused. "What else has she noticed?" There was a beat brief measured before Benjamin answered. "She would prefer to tell you herself, I think," he said, "if you were to ask her." He left. Nathaniel stared at his desk for a long moment. Then he stood and went to find his wife. He found her in the garden. Not the formal garden near the house, the working kitchen garden on the south side where the soil was dark and the rows were practical. She was kneeling beside a section of struggling plants, examining something with focused attention. A small notebook opened beside her on the ground. She had removed her gloves. Her hands were in the soil. She didn't hear him approach. He stood for a moment, watching her turn a plant's root between her fingers with the concentrated care of a physician examining a patient. And he felt the distinct sensation of intruding on something private. Not because what she was doing was private, but because her complete absorption in it was. "Mrs. Caldwell." She looked up. Not startled, she simply shifted her attention from the root to him, with the same unhurried directness she'd shown at the altar. "Mr. Caldwell." She didn't stand immediately, and he realized she was waiting to see whether the interruption was urgent enough to warrant it. When he didn't indicate urgency, she carefully set the root down, closed her notebook, and rose with the economical movement of someone who didn't waste energy on performance. "Benjamin told me you'd found some issues with the Harmon contract," he said. "A few things, yes." She brushed the soil from her hands. "I hope I haven't caused a problem by looking at the estate records. I should have asked first." "No," he said, and was surprised to mean it. "No, it was useful. What else have you found?" She looked at him. Not with suspicion, not with the wariness he might have expected from a woman who had spent 3 weeks being politely ignored by her husband. With assessment. The particular look of someone deciding whether a question is genuine or performative. Apparently she decided it was genuine. "Would you like to walk?" she said. "Some of it is easier to explain when you can see it." He walked with her for 2 hours. She showed him the unused eastern field, 40 acres, that had been left fallow for 5 years because his father had a disagreement with the tenant family who'd previously worked it and had never resolved the disagreement before he died. Clara had spoken with the family. They were willing to return. The acreage could be productive within 1 season. She showed him the mill account, a decades-old arrangement that had made sense when his grandfather established it, but had become a significant inefficiency as the region's infrastructure developed. She had already spoken with 2 alternative millers and had their rates in her notebook. She showed him the workers' housing on the North Quarter, conditions she described without dramatics, but with precision. Explaining matter-of-factly that 3 families were sharing structures meant for one, that the roofs were in poor repair, and that she had spoken with a local carpenter about costs which were considerably lower than he would have assumed. "The workers are more productive when they're not cold and crowded," she said, not as a lecture, not as an accusation, but as a plain fact she assumed he would find relevant. "It's not just decency, it's a practical return on investment." He was quiet for a moment. "How do you know all of this?" he asked. "You've been here 3 weeks. I listen," she said simply. "And I ask questions. People know things. They just need someone to ask." She paused. "Your workers know this estate better than any ledger does. I've been talking with them." "What do they think of?" He stopped. "Of you." She said it without evasion. "They're loyal. They have a great deal of loyalty to the Caldwell name. They want the estate to succeed." A beat. "They're not sure you want to hear what they know." He looked at her. "Do you always say what you think?" he asked. She considered this seriously, as though it was a genuine question deserving a genuine answer. "I say what seems useful," she said. "I find it saves time." He walked back to the house that evening with the distinct sensation of a man who had been holding a very expensive, very fragile thing, and had only just realized he'd been holding it wrong. That night, he sat alone in his study and did something he hadn't done in years. He thought carefully about whether he was the person he believed himself to be. The answer, examined honestly, was not as comfortable as he'd expected. He was a man who had convinced himself that efficiency was the same thing as wisdom. That order was the same as understanding. That knowing what needed to be done was the same as knowing the people doing it. Clara, in 3 weeks, had spoken with every worker on this estate. She knew their names, their families, their difficulties, their expertise. She had sat in the dirt and examined plant roots and had found 40 acres of unused income and a fraudulent supply contract and 3 families in inadequate housing, and she had done all of it without drama or self-congratulation, simply because it was there to be done. And he who had lived on this land his entire life had not. I thought about the letters burning in the fireplace. He thought about 6 months of invitations declined and questions unanswered, about the comfortable certainty that he already knew everything he needed to know about the woman he was marrying, about the ease with which he had decided she was unimportant before he'd asked her a single question. He had been wrong, not slightly wrong. Not wrong in the way a man is wrong when he misjudges a minor detail. Wrong in the foundational structural way, the way a building is wrong when the plans were drawn for a different piece of land entirely. He had built an entire understanding of who Clara Whitmore was without a single piece of evidence. And every piece of evidence he'd gathered since the wedding had contradicted that understanding completely. The question, the uncomfortable, necessary question, he sat with until nearly midnight was what he intended to do about it. He could continue as he was. Keep the civil distance. Manage the estate separately. Allow Clara to make her quiet improvements and note them in his ledger, and never acknowledge what they cost her in patience or what they revealed about his own failures of attention. He could do that. Or he could start over. Not with apology. Not yet. He didn't think he had earned the right to offer her an apology that she would be obligated to receive graciously, but with something more honest than what he'd been offering. He could start by asking questions. He could start by listening. He could start by treating the woman who had found in 3 weeks of marriage every problem his estate had accumulated in 3 decades, as though she was exactly what she so plainly was, the most capable person who had ever lived at Caldwell Manor. The next morning, he knocked on the door of the small sitting room she'd made into a working space, books stacked on the table, papers arranged with a system he didn't yet understand, the window open to let in the garden sounds. She looked up. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you showed me yesterday." "Yes, I'd like to hear everything else you've found." He paused. "Everything you haven't told me yet because you thought I might not want to hear it." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she opened her notebook. "In that case," she said, "we should probably start with the South Mill lease." He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. And for the first time in his marriage, for the first time perhaps in longer than that, Nathaniel Caldwell stopped talking and started listening. What he heard would change everything about how he understood himself. His estate, and the quiet woman he had dismissed without a second thought on a morning when he stood at a fireplace and burned 6 letters he should have read on the day they arrived. The South Mill lease, as it turned out, was only the beginning. Clara spread 3 pages of notes across the table between them, and Nathaniel leaned forward to read what she had written in that careful, unhurried hand he was beginning to recognize as distinctly hers, precise without being cold, thorough without being excessive. "The lease was signed in 1809, she said. "Your father agreed to a fixed rate regardless of harvest volume. In good years, that arrangement favored Harrow Mill. In poor years like the last 2, it still favored Harrow Mill. The estate absorbs the loss either way." "I knew the lease existed," Nathaniel said. "I didn't know the terms were structured that way. Most people don't read the fine print until it's already cost them something." She said it without just observation. The original agreement made sense in 1809. Harvest volumes were strong and consistent. What changed is that nobody revisited the terms when conditions changed. And the renegotiation clause is valid, but it has a window. She pointed to a line in her notes. "We have until the end of the current agricultural season to invoke it." After that, the lease rolls over automatically for another 7 years at the existing rate. Nathaniel calculated quickly in his head. The end of the agricultural season was 11 weeks away. Why didn't my father renegotiate? He asked. Clara was quiet for a moment. I spoke with Thomas Webb at the mill. He said your father and the mill owner had a personal falling out around 1812 and stopped communicating directly. The estate manager at the time handled correspondence, but he left the following year, and after that, the communication simply stopped. Nobody picked it back up. Because no one was looking at it. Because no one was looking at it, she confirmed. Nathaniel sat back. He thought about his father, the man who had built a comfortable life on an inheritance. He didn't fully understand and slowly, quietly allowed things to erode through inattention rather than malice. It was not a story he had ever wanted to see himself repeating. He was not sure sitting in this room with his wife's 3 pages of notes that he had successfully avoided it. What else? He said. She turned to the second page. Over the next hour, she walked him through 4 additional issues, a vendor relationship that had become quietly corrupt over 7 years of incremental overcharging, a boundary dispute with a neighboring property that had never been formally resolved and was now creating complications with a planned fence expansion, an annual tax filing that had been completed incorrectly for at least 3 consecutive years due to a misclassification of certain agricultural equipment, and a water rights arrangement on the North Quarter that 2 of the estate's workers had been flagging as problematic for over a year, with no one having followed up. Who did they flag it to? Nathaniel asked. Your previous estate manager, before he left last spring. And after he left, no one replaced that line of communication, she said. The workers didn't feel comfortable bringing concerns directly to... She stopped. To me, he finished. She didn't deny it. He looked at the table. 4 significant operational problems. All of them knowable. None of them new. Every one of them sitting in the infrastructure of this estate, like rot in floorboards invisible until you applied pressure to the right spot. You found all of this in 3 weeks, he said. I had time, she said. And I asked questions. I've been here 35 years. You had other things to do, she said, and her tone was genuinely without irony. Running an estate is different from understanding one. You were running it. I was learning it. He looked at her directly. Is there a difference? She met his eyes. Yes. Running something means managing what you already know. Understanding it means discovering what you don't. I was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, he could hear the sounds of the estate going about its morning, the distant voices of workers, the movement of animals, the ordinary rhythms of a place that was. He was beginning to understand considerably more complicated than he had allowed himself to recognize. I want to address the mill lease first, he said finally. Draft the letter. I'll review it today. All right. And I want to meet with Benjamin and the senior workers this week, all of them, in the same room. He paused. If they've been flagging problems that weren't being received, I want them to know that's changed. She looked at him for a moment with that particular quality of attention. He was learning to recognize, not surprised, not approving in a way that required his validation, simply noting something. That will matter to them, she said. It should have mattered to me sooner. She didn't offer him reassurance about that. He was beginning to understand that she wouldn't, and that this was one of the more honest things about her. She picked up her pen and began drafting the letter to Harrow Mill. He watched her write for a moment. The focused stillness, the pen moving without hesitation, and then he picked up the page of notes about the tax filing and started reading. It was the first morning of their marriage that felt like a partnership. I didn't say that to her. It seemed too large a thing to say when they had only just begun, and he didn't yet trust himself to say large things accurately where she was concerned. But he felt it the particular quality of 2 people working in the same direction, without one of them needing to diminish themselves to make room for the other. The meeting with Benjamin and the senior workers happened 4 days later. Nathaniel had called it for the morning in the main hall of the estate house, a room large enough for the 12 people he'd asked Benjamin to gather, informal enough that it didn't feel like a proceeding. He had not told anyone in advance what the meeting was about, which meant by the time it happened, Everyone had been speculating for 4 days, and the room had a particular electric quality of people who had prepared for multiple outcomes. Clara sat at the far end of the table. She had not asked to be included. He had asked her the evening before whether she would be willing to attend. She'd said yes without elaborating on whether she was surprised to be asked. He stood at the head of the table and looked at the people in front of him. He knew their names. He had always known their names. He wasn't careless about that, but he was aware more acutely than usual that knowing a name was a different thing from knowing a person. "I'll be direct," he said. "I understand there have been concerns raised about this estate's operations, the water rights situation on the North Quarter, the housing conditions, the mill arrangement that haven't been properly addressed. I want to know what else I'm not aware of, and I want to hear it from you." Silence. Not hostile silence, the more complicated kind where people are genuinely calculating risk, where they're deciding whether this is a performance or a genuine opening. Then Thomas Greer, who managed the North Quarter fields and had been with the estate for 22 years, spoke. "The north fence line, sir," he said. "There's a section that's been down since March. We repaired it temporary, but the permanent repair needs materials we requested in the spring budget and never received." "Why weren't they allocated?" Greer glanced down. "The request went to Mr. Simmons before he left. We sent the same request twice after but didn't hear back." Nathaniel looked at Benjamin. "I received one of those requests," Benjamin said quietly. "It fell into the reorganization after Simmons left. I should have followed up. That's on me." "The materials will be allocated this week," Nathaniel said. "What else?" It opened slowly at first, carefully, with the particular caution of people who have learned that bringing problems to the wrong person produces more problems. But as the first 2 or 3 concerns were received without consequence, the room changed. The caution didn't disappear, but it became less defensive, more practical. Over the next 90 minutes, he heard about 7 things he hadn't known. Not catastrophic things, nothing that would sink the estate on its own, but real things. Things that were costing money, or creating friction, or making good workers consider whether they wanted to be here for another year. At the far end of the table, Clara was writing. Not noticeably, just a quiet note here and there. He had the sense that she was documenting not for herself, but for him, so that he'd have a record after the meeting of what had been said. When the last person had spoken, Nathaniel looked around the table. "I want to be clear about something," he said. "What was described today, the requests that weren't followed up, the problems that sat unaddressed, that won't continue. I should have established a better channel for this a long time ago. I didn't. That's a failure of management, and it's mine." The room was very quiet. "I'm asking for your continued patience while we make corrections," he said. "And I'm asking you to keep bringing concerns forward. To Benjamin, or directly to me, or—" He glanced toward the end of the table. "To Mrs. Caldwell, who has been doing a great deal of listening on behalf of this estate, and who will continue to." Thomas Greer, who had started the conversation, looked at Clara with an expression that Nathaniel could only describe as recognition, as though he was seeing confirmed something he had already suspected. "She's already spoken with most of us," Greer said, "about the crops and the housing, and other things." He paused. "She asked good questions." "She does," Nathaniel said. Clara looked up from her notes. She didn't smile with performance, or deflect with modesty. She simply nodded once in acknowledgement, the way someone accepts a fact without needing to elaborate on it. After the meeting, as the workers filed out, and Benjamin began organizing the follow-up items, Clara walked up beside Nathaniel and spoke quietly. "That was well done," she said. He looked at her sideways. "You sound surprised." "Not surprised," she said. "Relieved. A beat. There's a difference." He turned that over in his mind for the rest of the day. The first indication that something was genuinely wrong came on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after the meeting. It arrived in the form of a letter, not from a neighbor or a business associate, but from the county recorder's office, delivered by a writer who had been paid extra for speed, and who handed it off to Benjamin with the pressed urgency of someone carrying something that couldn't wait. Benjamin brought it to Nathaniel immediately. He read it twice. Then he set it down on his desk and sat very still for approximately 30 seconds, which was as long as he allowed himself before he went to find Clara. She was in the kitchen garden again. She returned to it the way some people return to water whenever she needed to think, and she straightened when she saw his face. "What happened?" she said. He handed her the letter. She read it. Her expression didn't change dramatically. It focused the way a candle focuses a flame. When she finished, she looked up. "Frederick Granger," she said. "You know the name. I know the family. They own land to the west. They've been trying to expand for years." She turned the letter over as if checking whether the back held additional information. "He's claiming a portion of the eastern acreage falls within a boundary his grandfather established. He's filed with the county recorder." "It doesn't," Nathaniel said. "The boundary has been Caldwell land for 2 generations." "Do you have documentation?" He paused. Clara looked at him. "Nathaniel." She said his first name. She had used it occasionally in private, but the directness of it now cut through something. "Do you have the original boundary documentation? It should be in the estate records." "Where in the estate records?" I didn't answer immediately, because the honest answer was that he wasn't certain, and the more honest answer beneath that was that the estate records were organized according to a system his grandfather had established, and no one had fully decoded since. "I'll find it," he said. "We'll find it," she said, and handed the letter back to him. "I'll start with the documents from 1795 onward. You take the surveying records." She was already moving toward the house. "We should also send someone to the county recorder's office today to request a copy of what Granger filed. I want to see the documentation he's relying on." He followed her inside. "How do you know how these proceedings work?" "My father had a boundary dispute when I was 14, she said, not slowing down. "It went to a county hearing. I paid attention." She paused at the door to her working room. "I pay attention to most things. You may have noticed." He had noticed. They spent the better part of 2 days going through the estate's historical records, an archive that proved to be simultaneously more comprehensive and less organized than either of them had hoped. Clara had developed over her 6 weeks at Caldwell Manor an instinct for the estate's particular brand of administrative chaos, and she moved through it with the focused patience of someone dismantling a complicated knot. He worked beside her. Literally beside her, 2 people at the same table, passing documents back and forth, cross-referencing dates and names, occasionally reading passages aloud to each other, because a second set of ears on unclear language caught things a single reader missed. It was, he realized at some point during the second afternoon, the most extended time he had ever spent working alongside another person. Not managing someone. Not directing someone. Working beside them as an equal, where both people were contributing, and neither one was performing authority. He found the original boundary survey on the afternoon of the second day, tucked with the particular perversity of misfiled documents, inside a folder, labeled with his grandfather's first name rather than the estate name. "Here," he said. Clara looked up from her own stack. He crossed to her and spread the document between them. They read it together. The boundary line was exactly where Nathaniel had known it was. Granger's claim was based on a line that had never existed in the original survey. A phantom boundary that appeared in no official documentation and had been cited in the filing. Clara had obtained from the county recorder, from a single secondary source, a letter allegedly written by Nathaniel's grandfather to Granger's grandfather, outlining a verbal agreement about land use. "A verbal agreement," Nathaniel said. "That no one witnessed," Clara said. "That was never formalized. That contradicts the official survey conducted 2 years earlier." She sat back. "The question is whether the county recorder accepts the letter as sufficient to warrant a formal hearing. And if they do, then we present the survey documentation at the hearing and Granger loses." She paused. "But hearings take time, and Granger knows that. If he can tie this up in proceedings through the end of the season, the eastern acreage can't be contracted to tenant farmers, which means another season of lost income from those 40 acres. Nathaniel looked at the boundary survey in his hands. He thought about his father, the inattention, the unreturned correspondence, the disputes left to fester through discomfort with confrontation. He thought about the easy possibility of handling this. The same way, hire a solicitor, let the proceeding drag. Tell himself the law would eventually correct things, and there was nothing to be done faster. "No," he said. Clara looked at him. "I'm going to the county recorder's office myself," he said. "Tomorrow, with this document and a letter from our solicitor. I want this addressed before Granger has time to maneuver." Something shifted in her expression. Not surprised. She'd stopped being surprised by him in the straightforward way he'd noticed, and had moved into a different register of attention, one that felt more like watching than reacting. "That's the right move," she said. "You could come," he said. "If you're willing. You've been through the records more thoroughly than I have. If there are questions about the documentation, you'd know the answers faster." She was quiet for a moment. "You're asking me," she said, "not telling me." "You're not my employee," he said. "And it's not a small thing to ask." She looked at him for another moment. The assessment again, the genuine consideration that he was learning to read as a form of respect, actually. She evaluated things carefully because she took them seriously. "I'll come," she said. They left early the next morning. The county recorder's office was in the main town, half an hour's ride from the estate. In the carriage, they went over the documentation together. She had organized it the previous evening into a clear sequence, the original survey first, then supporting boundary confirmations from 1798 and 1802. Then the letter from Nathaniel's solicitor, establishing the legal framework for the estate's counterclaim. "If he pushes for a hearing anyway," Nathaniel said, "how long does that typically take to schedule?" "My father's took 8 weeks from the initial filing." She thought for a moment. But that was a more complicated case. A straightforward boundary dispute with clear documentation, possibly 4 to 6 weeks. "We can survive 4 to 6 weeks. "We can," she said. "But I'd rather we didn't have to." She looked out the window for a moment. "Granger is counting on the records being difficult to find. He's been watching this estate for a long time, I think. He knows the organizational history. He'd have to know it well to gamble on a claim this specific, or he knows someone who does." She turned back from the window. "Have you had any contact with anyone who had detailed access to the estate records in the past few years? Someone who left on uncertain terms?" He thought about it. Then he thought about it more carefully. "Simmons," he said. His previous estate manager, the one who had left the previous spring, the one whose departure had created the communication gaps they'd been filling ever since. He had full access to the records room. Clara's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened. "When exactly did Simmons leave?" she asked. "March," Nathaniel said. "Late March." "And when did Granger file the claim with the county recorder?" He already knew the answer before he finished the thought. "April," he said. "The second week of April." The carriage was very quiet for a moment. "We don't have proof," Clara said. "No," he agreed. "But it would explain how Granger knew exactly which acreage to target and exactly which records to hope you couldn't find quickly." She folded her hands on her lap. "It would also explain why the claim is based on a letter rather than official documentation. If someone with inside knowledge helped construct it, they'd know the official documentation contradicts it. They'd have to build the case on something that can't be cross-referenced. A fabricated verbal agreement, or a real letter taken out of context." She paused. "Either way, the official survey is cleaner than what they're working with. We have the stronger documentation. And if Simmons was involved," she looked at him steadily, "then we deal with that after we've protected the acreage. One thing at a time." He nodded. The county recorder's office was staffed by a man named Gerald Pettit, who had held the position for 17 years, and who received the arrival of a Caldwell with the particular combination of respect and wariness that the name tended to produce in official settings. Nathaniel had been in this office before twice on minor matters, and both times he had been brusque, transactional, and efficient. This time he took the time to sit down. Pettit was visibly uncertain about what to do with a Caldwell who was willing to sit. Clara sat beside Nathaniel. She placed the documentation on the desk between them with a quiet confidence that seemed to settle the room's temperature. Pettit looked at her, then at Nathaniel, then at the documents. "We're here regarding the Granger filing," Nathaniel said. "I understand a claim has been entered against a portion of our eastern boundary." "That's correct, Pettit said carefully. A preliminary review is... I'd like to resolve this before the preliminary review proceeds, Nathaniel said. We have the original boundary survey from 1793, confirmed by secondary documentation in 1798 and 1802. The eastern acreage is documented as Caldwell land, without interruption or amendment. He waited while Pettit examined the first document. The claim appears to be based on a letter that, to our knowledge, does not reflect any formal or legally recorded agreement. We'd like the official record to reflect our documentation before any proceeding is scheduled. Pettit looked at the survey. He looked at the 1798 confirmation. He looked at the solicitor's letter. This is thorough, he said in the tone of a man who had expected it to be less thorough. My wife organized it, Nathaniel said. Pettit looked at Clara. Clara met his look with calm equanimity and said nothing. She didn't need to. Pettit spent 20 minutes reviewing the documentation. He asked 3 questions, all of which Clara answered directly from memory. When he asked about the 1802 confirmation, specifically, a detail that required knowing where in the document sequence it sat and why it mattered, she answered with a precision that made Pettit glance at Nathaniel with an expression that Nathaniel could only interpret as reassessment. When it was done, Pettit sat back and folded his hands. The documentation you've provided is significantly stronger than what was filed in support of the Granger claim, he said. I can't make a final determination today. The process requires formal review. But I can tell you that the standard for proceeding to a hearing requires that the filing party demonstrate a plausible basis for the claim. In light of what you've brought today, I have questions about whether that standard is met. How long for formal review? Nathaniel asked. 2 weeks, Pettit said. If the filing party cannot provide stronger supporting documentation within that time, the claim may be dismissed without proceeding to a hearing. And if they do provide additional documentation, then we proceed to a hearing. Pettit looked at him. But I'd say your position is strong, Mr. Caldwell. Thank you, Nathaniel said. They were in the carriage again, heading back before either of them spoke. He didn't expect the documentation to be organized, Clara said. No. Nathaniel agreed. He expected to have to schedule a hearing. Granger expected the same thing. She looked out the window. The whole plan relied on the records being too disorganized to retrieve quickly, which they would have been 3 months ago. He thought about that. Before you arrived, he said. She didn't respond immediately. Not modestly, not with deflection, she seemed to be considering whether to say what she was thinking. Before we started working together, she said. He turned to look at her. She was still watching the road through the window. Her profile was quiet, composed, and entirely genuine. She hadn't said it to correct him, or to make a point about their partnership. She'd said it because it was accurate. Before we started working together. He held that phrase in his mind for the rest of the ride home, turning it over the way she'd turned that plant root between her fingers in the kitchen garden, examining it for what it was, rather than what he'd assumed it to be. He had assumed when he married Clara Whitmore that what he was acquiring was a financial arrangement, a transfer of resources, something clean and bounded and manageable at arm's length. He had been building something else entirely, without ever intending to, over the 6 weeks since she had arrived at Caldwell Manor, and opened her notebook and started asking questions no one had thought to ask. And sitting in that carriage on the road back from the county recorder's office, Nathaniel Caldwell began to understand with the slow, thorough comprehension of a man who has resisted understanding something for as long as he possibly could, that the reckoning he had been avoiding was coming regardless. Not the reckoning with Granger, not the reckoning with the estate's accumulated problems, the reckoning with himself, with the letters he had burned, with the 6 months he had spent deciding she was unimportant, with the arrogance it had taken to look at the woman sitting beside him and see nothing, absolutely nothing, of what was actually there. He had gotten lucky. That was the unbearable truth of it. He had behaved with stunning carelessness toward the one person who had turned out to matter most to everything he cared about, and he had gotten lucky enough that she was still here, still working, still treating the estate's problems as though they were her problems too. Even though he had given her no reason, not one single reason in the months before their marriage, or the early weeks of it, to invest herself in his survival. Why was she, The question arrived with the force of something he should have asked far sooner. He thought about it for the rest of the ride home. He thought about it through dinner, through the quiet evening, through the hour he sat in his study afterward pretending to review accounts. He was still thinking about it when he knocked on the door of her working room late that evening. The room was lit, which meant she was still there, which he'd suspected, and she called for him to come in. She was at the table. The day's documents were organized into neat stacks. She had been writing correspondence. It looked like not notes, and she set down her pen when he entered. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "Why are you doing this?" he said. She looked at him without confusion. She seemed to understand immediately what he was asking, which meant she had anticipated the question, which meant she had already thought about the answer. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She was quiet for a moment, turning her pen in her hands. The only indication that this wasn't an entirely comfortable question for her either. "I could tell you that it's my estate too," she said. "And that would be true." A pause. "I could tell you that I have practical reasons for wanting it to succeed. That's also true." "But," she looked at him directly. "But if I'm being honest, and I generally prefer to be, I came here prepared to make this work, regardless of what kind of man you turned out to be. Because I made a commitment. And I don't make commitments lightly, Lee. Even after he stopped. "After you burned my letters," she said, and he didn't flinch from it. "Yes, even then." She set the pen down. "I didn't know you had burned them until Benjamin told me about 3 weeks after the wedding. He felt I should know." A beat. He was right. "Clara, I'm not finished," she said. "When I found out I was angry. I want you to know that. I'm not telling you it didn't matter. It mattered." Her voice was steady. "But anger without direction is just noise. I decided to put my attention somewhere more useful. Into the estate. Into understanding the person I had married." She paused. "Which turned out to be more complicated than I expected." He looked at his hands. "I had entirely the wrong idea about who you were," he said, "before I met you." "I know," she said. "Most people do. It's one of the more useful things about being underestimated. People tend to leave you alone long enough to actually do things." She said it without bitterness, almost wryly, as though it were a minor tactical advantage she had learned to work with. He thought about 6 months of letters. About a woman who had been writing to him about gardens and childhood memories while he hadn't bothered to look at a single word. About the calm with which she had walked up that church aisle, knowing he hadn't read them, knowing exactly what kind of man she was about to marry, and coming anyway. "You knew what you were walking into," he said slowly. "On our wedding day. You knew I hadn't, you knew." I knew," she said simply. "And you came anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. "I had decided," she said, "that what a person does with what they're given matters more than what they're given." A pause. "You were given a chance to know me for 6 months. You didn't take it. I was given a marriage that started badly. I decided to take it anyway." She picked up her pen again. "We were both working with what we had." He was quiet for a long time. "I'm sorry," he said. "About the letters. About the 6 months before. About all of it." He paused. "I know a single apology doesn't—" "No," she said. "It doesn't." She looked at him steadily. "But it's the right place to start." He nodded. She turned back to her correspondence. He sat in the chair across from her for another few minutes, not speaking, not because he had nothing to say, but because silence. He was learning was something Clara used carefully, and that learning to sit in it without filling it was one of the more important things she had to teach him. When he stood to leave, she spoke without looking up. "The Harmon renegotiation letter went out this morning," she said. "We should have a response by the end of the week." "Good," he said. He stood at the door for a moment. "Clara." She looked up. "Thank you," he said. "For coming anyway." She held his gaze for a moment. "Earn it," she said simply. He left the room with the particular feeling of a man who has been handed something worth more than he deserved, and told clearly, and without cruelty, exactly what the price of keeping it would be. He intended to pay it. He was not yet sure he knew how. but he was, for the first time in a very long time, willing to learn. The response from Harrow Mill arrived on a Friday morning, and it was not what either of them had expected. Nathaniel read it standing in the front hallway, still holding the seal he'd broken, and his expression did something Clara had not yet seen it do. It went very still. Not the controlled stillness of a man managing a reaction, the involuntary kind where the face stops working because the mind is too occupied to run it. She took the letter from his hand and read it herself. The mill owner, a man named Porter Harrow, had not responded to the renegotiation request with counterterms or a meeting proposal. He had responded with a legal notice filed through his own solicitor, claiming that the Caldwell estate had breached the original contract 3 years prior by redirecting a portion of the water supply that fed the mill's primary grinding wheel. A redirection that, according to the notice, had caused significant operational damage and for which Harrow was now claiming compensation. Compensation that was, by the solicitor's calculation, significantly larger than the overpayments they'd hoped to recover. "This is manufactured," Clara said. "Obviously." Nathaniel's voice was flat. "He's been waiting for someone to challenge the contract. The moment we sent that letter, he filed this." She looked up from the page. "He had this ready." "Which means he knew the contract was vulnerable," Nathaniel said. "He knew he'd been overcharging, and he built a counterclaim in advance in case anyone looked closely enough to notice." "The water redirection claim, is there any basis for it?" "There was a water channel adjustment made about 4 years ago. The lower field had drainage problems. Benjamin authorized it. It had nothing to do with the mill's supply line." "Do we have documentation of that?" He looked at her. She already knew the answer from his expression. "We need to find it," she said. "If it exists." "It exists," she said with a certainty that made him look at her more carefully. "Benjamin authorized it. Benjamin documents everything. I've worked with him long enough to know that. Where does he keep his personal records?" 20 minutes later, they were in Benjamin's office, a small, meticulously organized room off the east wing that Nathaniel had entered perhaps twice in the past year. Benjamin himself stood near the window with the letter in his hand, reading it with the expression of a man who is very carefully not saying what he's thinking. "The channel adjustment records," Clara said. "Where would you have filed them?" "Agricultural Improvements, 1812, Benjamin said immediately. He crossed to the shelf, pulled a bound record book without hesitation, and opened it to a page that might as well have been waiting for exactly this moment. "Here. Dated April the 4th, 1812. The adjustment was to the south drainage channel entirely within the estate's own water rights. The mill supply line wasn't touched that runs 15 yards to the north. I have the original surveyor's diagram." He produced it from the same record book. A hand-drawn diagram, precise and dated, showing both the drainage channel and the mill supply line as entirely separate systems, with no point of intersection. Nathaniel held the diagram and looked at it for a long moment. "He's lying," he said. Not with heat, with the cold exact recognition of a man examining evidence. "He's lying," Benjamin confirmed. "And he's been planning to lie for some time, I'd reckon. That notice was drafted by a solicitor who knew the specifics of our water arrangements. That doesn't happen overnight." Clara looked at Nathaniel. The same question as Granger. Someone gave him information. The three of them stood in Benjamin's office with that thought settling over the room like weather coming in. "Simmons," Benjamin said quietly. It wasn't a question. "He left in March," Nathaniel said. "Granger filed in April. Now Harrow files a counterclaim the day after our renegotiation letter arrives. He'd have to know the details of the water adjustment to construct this." He stopped. "Simmons was here for 12 years. He knew everything." "Why would he?" Clara began. "Because I dismissed him," Nathaniel said. "I dismissed him last March because the accounts from the previous quarter showed irregularities I couldn't explain. I told him it was a restructuring. It wasn't." He paused. "He knew I suspected him, and apparently he decided the best response was to make sure I had considerably larger problems than the ones I'd found. The silence that followed was the particular kind that comes after a revelation that reframes everything that came before it, where you find yourself looking backward through a different lens and seeing the same events in an entirely different shape. All of it connects," Clara said slowly. Granger Harrow, the manufactured claims. Simmons spent 12 years learning every vulnerability this estate had. And then he left and sold that knowledge to every person with a grievance and the money to use it. How many more are there? Nathaniel said. He wasn't asking rhetorically. He was asking her specifically because she was the one who had been reading the records. She thought for a moment. The Harmon seed contract, she said. We renegotiated that. But Harmon's response was unusually quick. He accepted new terms without pushback, which seemed like good fortune at the time. She paused. What if he'd already been told the renegotiation was coming, and decided accepting small losses now was better than having the whole contract examined? Nathaniel looked at her. The boundary dispute, she continued. The water claim, the seed contract. If Simmons gave each of them just enough information to construct a plausible position. Then we're not dealing with three separate problems, Nathaniel said. We're dealing with one coordinated effort. Benjamin sat down heavily in his chair. He was a man of 55 who had survived decades of Caldwell crises with his composure intact, and the fact that he sat down without ceremony told Nathaniel more about the seriousness of the moment than anything else could have. What do we do? Benjamin said. Clara answered before Nathaniel could. We stop reacting, she said, and we start moving first. Both men looked at her. She was very calm. Not the calm of someone who wasn't feeling the weight of the situation. He could see in the set of her jaw that she felt it entirely, but the calm of someone who had already moved past feeling it and arrived at deciding what to do about it. The Harrow claim is fraudulent, she said. We have documentation that disproves it completely. We respond immediately, not through the solicitor's usual pace, but immediately. Today. We send the surveyor's diagram, Benjamin's records, and a letter making clear that we are aware the claim is manufactured and that we are prepared to pursue that awareness in the appropriate forums. You want to tell Harrow we know he's lying, Nathaniel said. I want to tell Harrow we can prove he's lying, she said. Those are different things. One is an accusation, the other is a warning. She turned to Benjamin. Can you write a clear account of the water adjustment, what was done, why, and that the mill supply line was unaffected in a form that could be presented to the county recorder? I can have it done by this afternoon, Benjamin said, and there was something in his voice, a quality she hadn't heard directed at her before, that she recognized as the particular respect of a person who had been watching someone carefully for weeks and had just seen their final assessment confirmed. Good, she said. She turned to Nathaniel. The Granger claim we're already positioned on, but we should also go back to Pettit at the recorder's office and make him aware that there appears to be a coordinated effort. He needs to understand the context. He may not want to be involved in that kind of accusation without proof, Nathaniel said. He doesn't need to make the accusation, she said. He needs to be aware of the pattern. There's a difference between asking an official to take a position and informing him of facts he ought to know when he's in the middle of reviewing a filing. She looked at him steadily. Pettit is a careful man. He'll understand what we're telling him without us having to say it plainly. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, looking at his wife in the office of his estate manager on a Friday morning, while everything around him was quietly coming apart, and he was aware, more aware than he had been of anything in a long time, that if she had not been here, if he had successfully maintained the careful distance he'd planned on maintaining in this marriage, he would be facing this alone, and he would have been entirely unprepared. All right, he said. We do it your way. Our way, she said. He didn't argue. They sent the response to Harrow's solicitor that same afternoon, a precise documented rebuttal that arrived by Benjamin's calculation within 36 hours of the original notice. The speed of it was deliberate. They wanted Harrow and anyone advising him to understand that the era of an unattended Caldwell estate was over. The following Tuesday they went back to Gerald Pettit. Nathaniel had sent ahead a note requesting the meeting, which was unusual enough that Pettit was visibly prepared for something significant when they arrived. He sat behind his desk with the posture of a man who had been thinking since the note arrived. Clara let Nathaniel lead the conversation this time. Not because she couldn't, he had stopped thinking in those terms by now, but because she had told him on the way over that Pettit was more likely to receive the information in the right spirit from the estate's named owner, and that her role in the room would be to provide documentation when needed. I want to be transparent with you about something, Nathaniel said. I believe the Granger filing and a separate claim filed recently by Porter Harrow of the mill are connected. And I believe the connection runs through a former employee of mine who had access to detailed information about this estate's operations. Pettit's expression did not change in any dramatic way. It became more careful. That's a significant claim, he said. I'm not asking you to make a judgment about it, Nathaniel said. I'm providing you with context that I believe is relevant to how you proceed with the Granger review. He nodded to Clara. She placed the documentation on the desk, the timeline she had constructed the previous day, showing the sequence of Simmons's departure, the Granger filing, the Harmon contract response, and the Harrow claim with dates and a brief explanatory note for each. It was not accusatory. It was factual. It was the kind of document that did the speaking for itself without requiring its author to editorialize. Pettit looked at it for a long time. You understand I can't take any formal action based on circumstantial timing, he said. I understand, Nathaniel said. I'm not asking you to. Pettit looked at the timeline again. Then he looked at Clara with the same reassessing quality he'd shown the first time. This was your work, he said. We worked on it together, she said. Pettit glanced between them and did not pursue the point, but something in his demeanor shifted the barely perceptible shift of a man who has updated his understanding of a situation in a way he won't announce but will act on. I'll complete the formal review of the Granger filing within the week, he said. I believe I have what I need to make a determination. A pause. I'd encourage you to continue documenting what you've described to me today. We intend to, Clara said. Outside in the street. Nathaniel stopped walking. Clara stopped beside him. He's going to dismiss the Granger claim, he said. Yes, she said. I think so. And Harrow's solicitor received our documentation yesterday. They'll know the water claim won't survive scrutiny. They'll withdraw it, she said. Probably within the week. He turned to look at her. The street was busy around them. People moving horses, passing the ordinary noise of a town, conducting its business. And in the middle of all of it, Clara stood with her hands folded and her expression as composed as it had been on the day she walked up the church aisle, and he felt with sudden sharp clarity the full weight of what it had cost her to be that steady, not just in the past month. In the months before their wedding, when she'd sent 6 letters to a man who burned them without reading them. In the weeks after the wedding, when she'd arrived at an estate that needed her and a husband who hadn't wanted to need anyone. Through every quiet morning in the kitchen garden, and every evening with the notebook, and every conversation with workers who'd been invisible to everyone else. She had held herself together through all of it, not because she didn't feel things. He understood now that she felt things very deeply, more deeply perhaps than he allowed himself to. But that she had learned somewhere along the way that falling apart was a luxury, and that the people around her needed her to stay standing. How long have you been carrying this much? He said. She looked at him. Carrying what? All of it. He gestured imprecisely, inadequately at the general space where the past several weeks lived. The records, the claims, the strategy, the documentation. Keeping track of all of it while I was learning to ask the right questions. She was quiet for a moment. It's not carrying if it's what you want to be doing, she said. But her voice was slightly different, a fraction less steady than usual, like a string tuned a half-tone higher than comfortable. Clara. She looked away briefly, just briefly, then back. I had something to prove, she said. To myself mostly. Not to you, you weren't even paying attention, which made it easier in some ways. She said it without blame. I needed to know that I could do this, that I was right about what I thought I was capable of. A pause. I've spent a long time being told very politely that my interests were unusual for a woman, that understanding farming and finance was charming perhaps, but not serious. Who told you that? Everyone, she said. My mother, the families we socialized with, the men my father introduced me to before you. She looked at him directly. You were not the first man to decide I was unimportant before you'd asked me a question. You were simply the one I married. He held her gaze. I'm sorry, he said. And then, because one apology hadn't been enough the first time, and he suspected she needed to hear it, said in the specific context of what she'd just told him. Not just for the letters. for being another person who made that decision. You deserved better than that from the beginning." She was very still for a moment. Then she nodded once, just once, with the particular quality of someone who has been waiting to hear something said, and now that it has been said, doesn't need to make more of it than it is. "Come on," she said. "We have a letter to send to the county recorder confirming our documentation is complete." They walked back toward the carriage. He noticed for the first time that she walked slightly differently when she wasn't in the estate, not more relaxed exactly, but less contained. As though being outside the walls of Caldwell Manor allowed some quality in her to take up slightly more space. He filed that away. He was getting better at filing things away where she was concerned for examination later when he had time to understand them properly. The Granger claim was dismissed 11 days later. The official notice arrived on a Wednesday morning, dry and procedural in the way of official documents, but Nathaniel read it in the hallway and felt something loosen in his chest that had been pulled tight since the first letter arrived from the county recorder's office. He went directly to Clara's working room. She was at the table. She read the notice when he handed it to her. She looked at it for a moment, then set it down precisely in the center of the table. "Good," she said. "That's all," he said. She looked up. Something in her eyes was warmer than the word. "What would you like me to say?" "I don't know. Something more than good." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the shape of one. "We won the opening round," she said. "Harrow's claim is still pending. We don't know what else Simmons may have set in motion. Good is accurate. Celebratory seems premature." He laughed. It surprised him the laugh came before he'd decided to laugh, which was unusual for him. Clara looked at him with the particular expression of someone witnessing something unexpected in a person they thought they'd started to understand. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. But the shape around her eyes was different now. "It's good to hear you laugh." He didn't have an immediate answer for that. She picked up her pen and returned to her work. He stood in the doorway for a moment, holding the dismissal notice, thinking about the word good, about the ways she used language economically, never exceeding what she meant, never retreating from it. And he thought about what she'd said in the street, about being told her interests were unusual, about being dismissed before she'd been asked, about being the only woman in most rooms who understood what she was talking about, and having spent years pretending not to notice. The Harrow situation resolved itself 4 days after the Granger dismissal, and it resolved in a way none of them had fully anticipated. Porter Harrow did not withdraw the claim through his solicitor. He came to the estate himself. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a carriage that had seen better days, with the look of a man who had spent several days rehearsing something and was no longer certain his rehearsal had covered the right material. He was shown into the main study, where Nathaniel received him with Benjamin present, and where Clara was by what Nathaniel suspected was deliberate instinct rather than coincidence, also present seated at the side table with her notebook open. Harrow looked at her when he came in. Then he looked at Nathaniel. Then he looked at her again. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, as though confirming something. "Mr. Harrow," she said pleasantly. Harrow sat in the chair across from Nathaniel's desk. He had the posture of a man who had made a decision he wasn't entirely comfortable with and was moving forward on it anyway because the alternative was worse. "I came to discuss the claim," he said. "I assumed as much," Nathaniel said. "The documentation you sent." Harrow started and stopped. "The surveyor's diagram is accurate, Nathaniel said. "The water channel adjustment did not affect the mill supply line. Benjamin authorized it and documented it completely." Harrow looked at his hands. "I was told otherwise." "By whom?" Nathaniel said. His voice was even. Harrow was quiet for a moment. The quality of that silence was the specific quality of a man deciding how much of the truth he could afford to tell. "A man came to me in April," Harrow said. "He said he'd worked for the Caldwell estate. He said there were financial irregularities being covered up, and that if I filed a claim based on the water issue, it would be easy to win because the estate couldn't produce the documentation to refute it." He paused. "He said I'd been cheated by the original contract and that this was a way to recover." "And you believed him," Nathaniel said. "I believed him enough," Harrow said. He looked up. I've been struggling since the drought 2 seasons back. The mill's not it hasn't been profitable the way it was. He told me the estate had money and wasn't paying what it owed. I wanted to believe there was a way out of the debt. Clara set down her pen. What was his name? She said. Harrow looked at her. He called himself Martin, gave a forwarding address in Richmond. Martin Simmons, Benjamin said. Harrow looked at him. Something in his face confirmed it before he spoke. He didn't tell me his full name, he said. But yes, that sounds right. Nathaniel looked at his desk for a moment. When he looked up, his expression was different. Not the cold exactitude of a man building a legal case, but something more human than that. He looked at Harrow, the way a man looks at another man. When he recognizes a version of desperation he could have felt himself under different circumstances. You were lied to, he said. I was, Harrow said. And I made the mistake of letting that liar point me at someone else's problem. He looked Nathaniel in the eye. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't willing to believe it. I was. That's on me. Yes, Nathaniel said. It is. A pause. But it's also the case that the original contract was unfair. The terms were set in a time when they made sense, and they were never adjusted when circumstances changed. That's on us. Harrow looked at him carefully. What are you proposing? He said. Nathaniel glanced at Clara. She was already writing something in her notebook. Without looking up, revised terms. Fair market rate for the current supply, with a quality provision going forward. The Harrow claim is withdrawn with prejudice, which means it cannot be refiled. The estate doesn't pursue the filing as fraudulent, as long as Mr. Harrow cooperates with our inquiry into who approached him and what he was told. Harrow stared at her. My wife is also the estate's business manager, Nathaniel said. Effectively. I can see that, Harrow said slowly. Do the terms sound workable? She asked, still writing. Harrow looked at the man across the desk from him, a man who had every legal right to pursue the fraudulent claim aggressively, and who was instead offering him a fair contract and a way out, and then at the woman at the side table, who had constructed that offer in 30 seconds from memory. Yes, he said. They're workable. Good, Clara said. She tore the page from her notebook and placed it on the desk between them. I'll have the formal document prepared by the end of the week. We'll need your solicitor's details. After Harrow left with a handshake with a formal note about the forthcoming document with the slightly dazed expression of a man who had arrived prepared to negotiate and instead received something better than he'd come to ask for. Benjamin closed the study door and turned to look at both of them. Well, he said. Clara was already returning to her notebook. He'll cooperate with the inquiry, she said. He has no loyalty to Simmons. Simmons used him, and he knows it. Whatever information Harrow has about how Simmons approached him, how much he was paid, who else he may have contacted, we'll get it. That gives us grounds to pursue Simmons, Nathaniel said. More than grounds, she said. If Simmons approached Granger and Harrow, both there may be others. And if we can establish a pattern of deliberate sabotage approaching multiple parties with false information to damage the estate, that's not just a civil matter. Nathaniel looked at her. You're thinking about a criminal filing, he said. I'm thinking about all the options, she said. We don't have to decide today, but we should know what we're building toward before we decide what to do with what Harrow tells us. She looked up from her notebook. What we do with Simmons matters as much as what we do about Simmons. The county will be watching how we handle this. I hadn't thought about that. He had been thinking about Simmons the way he tended to think about problems in terms of resolution, of containing the damage of getting past it. Clara was thinking about it the way she thought about everything as a public act, with consequences beyond the immediate situation. You're right, he said. She looked at him. I know, she said. And then very slightly, you're getting better at saying that. I've had practice, he said. Benjamin made a quiet sound near the door that might in a different man have been a laugh. That evening, for the first time since the claims had started arriving, Nathaniel did not spend the evening in his study. He found Clara in the sitting room after dinner. She was reading something she did with the same focused attention she brought to everything, and she looked up when he came in. "I want to ask you something," he said. She closed the book. He sat across from her. "Before you came here," he said, "before the wedding, what did you think this would be?" She considered the question seriously. "I thought it would be difficult," she said. "I thought you would be difficult. I thought the estate would be more straightforward, and the marriage more complicated." A small pause. "I was half right." "Which half?" "The estate," she said. "The estate was not straightforward." He was quiet for a moment. "And the marriage," he said. She looked at him, the full direct gaze that he had stopped finding unsettling somewhere along the last several weeks, and had started finding instead something he would not yet put a word to. "The marriage," she said carefully, "has been not what I expected. In some ways, harder." A pause. "In some ways, considerably better." He held her gaze. "Better how?" he said. She was quiet for a moment, not evading thinking. She thought before she spoke always, and he had learned that the pause was where the truth was being retrieved rather than constructed. "I thought I would be here alone," she said finally, "working alongside someone who tolerated me at best. I thought I would build something and hand it to a man who would take credit for it and go back to ignoring me." She looked down at the closed book in her hands, then back up. "That is not what happened." "No," he said. "It isn't." "You changed," she said, "faster than I expected, more completely." A pause. "I want to be honest with you, I'm still deciding what to do with that. With you." She said it not unkindly. "I'm a cautious person. You gave me reasons to be cautious. And now you're giving me reasons to be less so. I'm working out how much to trust that." He nodded slowly. "That's fair," he said. "I know," she said. "Most things I say are fair. It's one of my better qualities, and also, I'm told, occasionally annoying." He looked at her. She was watching him with something in her eyes that was different. Not warm exactly, not in the uncomplicated way warmth usually presented itself. Something more considered than that. Something that had been decided rather than felt, and was only now beginning to feel like what it had always been. He thought about 6 letters burning in a fireplace. I thought about earning it. He thought about all the distance between the man he had been on that morning and the man sitting in this room now, and he understood more clearly than he had understood it until this moment that the distance wasn't something he should be proud of having crossed. It was something he should be grateful she had waited for him to cross. "Clara," he said. "Nathaniel," she said, and for a moment in the sitting room of a manner that had been slowly dying and was now through the work of 2 people who had started as strangers and become something neither of them had yet named. Beginning to live again, they simply looked at each other. Outside somewhere on the estate, a night bird called once and went quiet. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Neither of them needed to. The night bird's call had faded into silence, but something in that sitting room had shifted quietly, irrevocably, the way seasons turn without announcing themselves. Neither Nathaniel nor Clara spoke of it the following morning. They didn't need to. It lived between them now, unnamed but present like a door that had been opened and couldn't be shut again without both of them pretending they hadn't seen what was on the other side. Nathaniel noticed it in the small things first. The way she handed him his coffee at breakfast before he asked for it, because she had learned without him telling her that he took it before the ledgers, and after the morning report from Benjamin. The way he had started leaving the study door open in the evenings, a thing he had never done before, because the sound of her moving through the adjacent hallway had become something he listened for without admitting he was listening. They were building a language between them. Quiet and practical, made of shared glances across a table full of documents of her pen. Pausing when he said something she was filing away, of him asking her opinion on things he would have decided alone 6 weeks ago. It wasn't love, or if it was love in its earliest form, before it knew its own name, before it had gathered the courage to speak plainly. But it was real, and it was growing. What interrupted it was a letter from Richmond. It arrived on a Monday, addressed to Nathaniel with a return address he didn't recognize. He opened it at his desk, while Clara sat across from him, reviewing the revised Harrow contract terms before sending them for formal signature. He read it once. Then he read it again. "What is it?" she said without looking up. She had developed an instinct for the quality of his silences. He handed it across the desk. She read it. The letter was from a solicitor named Aldous Crane, based in Richmond, writing on behalf of a client he declined to name directly, but described as a party with significant interest in the future disposition of Caldwell Manor and its associated agricultural holdings. Crane's letter was smooth formal, and underneath its professional surface, unmistakably threatening. It claimed that a review of public records had revealed substantial questions about the validity of the original Caldwell land grant, the foundational document upon which the entire estate's legal standing rested, and suggested that his unnamed client would be prepared to pursue those questions formally, unless a mutually agreeable arrangement regarding the estate's future could be reached. A mutually agreeable arrangement. Clara set the letter down. "This is different," she said. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "The Granger claim was about acreage. The Harrow claim was about a contract. This—" She looked at the letter again. "This is about the foundation, the original grant. If the grant is successfully challenged, the estate itself is at risk," she said. "Not a portion of it, all of it." They looked at each other across the desk. "Is there a basis for challenging the grant?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. "I've never examined it closely. It predates my father. It goes back to my grandfather." "Then we need to examine it," she said. "Today." She was already standing. The original land grant was kept, they discovered after 20 minutes of searching the archive room with Benjamin in a locked metal strongbox that had been stored behind a false panel in the estate library's back wall. Benjamin knew of the panel. He had not opened it in 7 years because the previous occasion had been his employer's death and the inventory of the estate. He opened it now. The grant itself was a large document folded into quarters, brittle at the edges, in the way of paper that has been stored correctly but is simply old. The ink had faded to brown but remained legible. Nathaniel spread it carefully on the library table, and he and Clara read it together, shoulder to shoulder, in the particular focused silence of two people examining something important. It was dated 1771. It bore the seal of the Virginia colonial government and the signature of the acting governor at the time. It granted the Caldwell land 2,000 acres in Harrow County to Nathaniel's grandfather, James Caldwell, in recognition of services rendered to the colonial administration during a period Nathaniel's history of his own family had always described vaguely as public service. "What services?" Clara said. "I was told it was administrative work," Nathaniel said. "I never knew the specifics." She was looking at a line near the bottom of the grant, a clause he had passed over in the first reading. "Read this," she said. He leaned closer. The clause stated that the grant was conditional upon the Caldwell family's continued lawful occupation and productive use of the land, and that in the event the land fell into abandonment, legal forfeiture, or substantive dispute, the granting authority, now transferred to the Commonwealth of Virginia, retained the right to review the terms of the original conveyance. "That clause," Clara said slowly, "that's what Crane's client is relying on." "Substantive dispute," Nathaniel said. "The Granger filing was a substantive dispute," she said. "Dismissed, but it was filed. The Harrow claim was filed. If someone has been engineering these disputes deliberately, not just to cause damage, but to create a record of disputes that could be cited to invoke that clause." The thought arrived complete and cold. "Simmons," Nathaniel said. "Simmons didn't do this alone," Clara said. "Simmons was a former estate manager with grudges and information. He could manipulate Granger and Harrow. But hiring Aldous Crane in Richmond, a solicitor who works for clients with significant interest in the estate's future that requires money and strategy, that requires someone who already knew about this clause, someone who read the original grant, someone who had access to this room," she said. They both looked at the strongbox. "Benjamin," Nathaniel said, and his voice was careful because he didn't want what he was saying to be true. "No," Clara said immediately, firmly. "Not Benjamin. Benjamin has been with your family for 30 years. His entire life's work is tied to this estate's survival." She paused. "But someone with access to this room. Someone who knew the panel existed." Nathaniel thought. My cousin Edmund, he said. The name settled into the room like a stone dropping into still water. Edmund Caldwell, who had stood at his side at the altar on the wedding day, who visited the estate 3 or 4 times a year, who had always been pleasant and slightly too interested in the financial details of Caldwell operations, who had been present. Nathaniel now recalled with a clarity that felt like cold water. When Nathaniel had shown the estate archives to a visiting solicitor 2 years prior, and Edmund had lingered in the library afterward, asking questions about the documents on the shelves. He's your heir, Clara said. If the estate goes under, if the land reverts to the Commonwealth through a grant challenge, who would be positioned to negotiate for its acquisition at a favorable price? Who has the family name and enough social standing to make a plausible claim on preferential treatment? Nathaniel didn't answer because the answer was obvious. He's been patient, Clara said. Years. He set this in motion long before Simmons left. Simmons may have been his instrument, someone he found cultivated and used to create the record of disputes he needed. She looked at Nathaniel. Did Edmund know Simmons? Nathaniel thought back. Edmund visited last winter. Simmons was still here. They would have met at dinner. More than met, I'd wager, she said. He looked at his cousin's name, as though he was seeing it written somewhere for the first time. Edmund, who had sent a congratulatory letter when the wedding was announced, and had written in his flowing hand how delighted he was that Nathaniel had finally secured the estate's future. Edmund, who had attended the reception and been charming to Clara, and told Nathaniel afterward privately that she seemed like a sensible woman, which had seemed complimentary at the time, and now sounded like something else entirely. We need proof, Nathaniel said. We have the beginning of a thread, Clara said. Harrow told us Simmons approached him in April. Simmons left the estate in March. Edmund was here in January. She paused. If Harrow can tell us more about what Simmons said specifically, whether Simmons mentioned a third party, a beneficiary, someone who would benefit from the estate's collapse. I need to go to Richmond, Nathaniel said. She looked at him. Not to Crane, he said. To the Commonwealth's land registry. If there's been any preliminary inquiry made about the original grant, any formal question, raised any request for review of the conditional clause, it would be recorded. If Edmund has been in contact with the Commonwealth's office, there will be a record. Clara was quiet for a moment. That's the right move, she said. But it takes time we may not have. If Crane's letter is already in our hands, it means his client is ready to move. The disputes have been filed, dismissed, or withdrawn, but the record of them exists. He may be prepared to file the grant challenge as soon as he calculates we're off balance. Then we need to move faster than he expects, Nathaniel said. Again. She nodded once. I'll draft a response to Crane's letter, she said. Professional non-committal requesting clarification of his client's position. That buys us time without revealing what we know. She was already moving toward the door. How soon can you leave for Richmond? Tomorrow morning. Take Benjamin, she said. He knows the Commonwealth's administrative structure better than you do. He handled the estate's tax filings for 15 years, and he knows where the records are kept. She paused at the door. And Nathaniel. He looked at her. Be careful about Edmund, she said. Until you have proof he's still your cousin, don't let him know you're looking. He nodded. She left the room. He stood alone with the original land grant spread on the library table, and he thought about his grandfather, who had received this document in 1771, and his father who had inherited it, and slowly allowed everything around it to decay, and himself, who had spent 35 years believing the Caldwell name was sufficient armor against the world's complications. It wasn't. It never had been. What had actually been protecting him for the past several months was the woman in the next room drafting a letter with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided that his survival was worth her effort, even when he had given her every reason to decide otherwise. He folded the grant carefully and returned it to the strongbox. He locked it himself this time and kept the key. Nathaniel and Benjamin left for Richmond the following morning before dawn. They rode rather than took the carriage, faster and less conspicuous. Benjamin, who had spent 30 years observing the Caldwell family with the particular patience of someone who loved them, despite their considerable faults, said very little for the first hour of the journey. Then, as the sky was lightening ahead of them, he spoke. She's remarkable, he said. simply without preamble, as though continuing a conversation they'd already been having. "I know," Nathaniel said. "You didn't know," Benjamin said. "In March you didn't know. You burned her letters." Nathaniel looked at the road ahead. "I know that too," he said. Benjamin was quiet for a moment. "She never mentioned it to me. I told her because I thought she ought to know, and she thanked me for telling her, and she never mentioned it again. Never used it against you. Never brought it into a single conversation as a point of leverage." He paused. "Most people couldn't have managed that." "She's not most people," Nathaniel said. "No," Benjamin agreed. "She's considerably better than most people." Another pause. "She's also considerably better than you deserve, if you'll forgive me saying so." "I won't forgive you," Nathaniel said. "Because you're right, and forgiveness implies I disagree." Benjamin made the sound again, the one that was almost a laugh. It was becoming more frequent. The Commonwealth's Land Registry Office in Richmond was a large, methodical institution staffed by men who took their record-keeping with religious seriousness, and who received visitors with the particular wariness of people who understood that access to official records was access to power. Nathaniel gave his name and his purpose a review of the original Caldwell land grant documentation and any subsequent inquiries registered against it, and was shown after a 20-minute wait to a records clerk named Whitfield, who had the careful demeanor of someone who was very good at his job and very aware of it. "The Caldwell grant," Whitfield said. "Harrow County, 1771. "That's correct." Whitfield disappeared into the back for 11 minutes. When he returned, he carried a ledger and a separate folder of correspondence. "The grant is registered in good standing," he said. "However, there has been a preliminary inquiry filed regarding the conditional clause." Nathaniel kept his expression neutral. "When was the inquiry filed?" Whitfield opened the ledger. "February of this year." February. 2 months before Simmons had left the estate. 1 month before the Granger filing. "By whom?" Nathaniel said. Whitfield looked at the record. "The inquiry was filed on behalf of an unnamed client by a solicitor named Aldous Crane Richmond." Benjamin, standing slightly behind Nathaniel, made no sound, but Nathaniel felt him go very still. "Is there a record of correspondence associated with the inquiry?" Nathaniel said. "There is." Whitfield placed the folder on the counter. "Per standard procedure, the filing party was required to provide documentation supporting the basis for the inquiry. The supporting documentation is on record." Nathaniel opened the folder. The supporting documentation included a copy of the Granger boundary filing, filed in April, attached to the February inquiry in what appeared to be a subsequent amendment, and a statement from an unnamed informant describing patterns of mismanagement and legal irregularity at Caldwell Manor that the filing party argued constituted the substantive dispute required to invoke the conditional clause. The statement was unsigned, but the language was precise in a way that required insider knowledge. Details about the mill contract, the water channel, the record-keeping gaps. Things that a former estate manager would know. Things that someone with money and a long-term plan would have paid to have documented. At the bottom of the supporting documentation in the section marked "Correspondence from interested parties," there was a letter. Nathaniel read the first 2 lines and stopped. The letter was signed Edmund Caldwell. It was dated January, 4 weeks before the formal inquiry had been filed, and it expressed in Edmund's flowing hand his concern as a family member for the deteriorating situation at Caldwell Manor, and his belief that the Commonwealth had an obligation to examine whether the estate's current management was meeting the conditions of the original grant. It suggested helpfully that the writer would be available to assist the Commonwealth in any transition proceedings should a review find the grant's conditions unmet. Nathaniel set the letter down on the counter. He stood very still for a moment. "Can I obtain a certified copy of this documentation?" he said. "For a fee," Whitfield said. "Whatever the fee is," Nathaniel said, "I'll pay it now." He walked out of the registry office 40 minutes later with a certified copy of every document in the folder, including Edmund's letter, folded precisely and placed in his coat. Benjamin walked beside him in silence until they reached the street. "Your own cousin," Benjamin said. "Yes." 35 years, Benjamin said. He's been at family dinners and weddings and your father's funeral, Nathaniel. He was at your father's funeral. I know. And all the while, I know, Nathaniel said. They stood on the street in Richmond, in the noise and movement of a city going about its business, and Nathaniel felt something he hadn't expected to feel in that moment. Not rage, not the hot, immediate fury he might have anticipated when he imagined discovering a betrayal of this magnitude. He felt tired, the kind of tired that comes not from effort, but from realizing how long something has been happening without your knowledge. How many hours of your life have been spent in proximity to something rotten while you were busy believing in surfaces? We go back, he said. Today. What do you intend to do? Nathaniel thought about Clara. About what she'd said before he left. Be careful about Edmund. Don't let him know you're looking. About the way she thought in sequences and consequences, in the difference between what was legally sufficient and what was strategically correct. I intend to talk to my wife, he said. They rode back faster than they'd come. Nathaniel pushed the pace, and Benjamin matched it without complaint, and they arrived at Caldwell Manor in the late afternoon with the horses breathing hard and the light going amber through the trees. Clara was in the front hallway when he came through the door. She took one look at his face. You found it, she said. Edmund, he said. It was Edmund from the beginning. She didn't look surprised. She looked the way she looked when a calculation she'd been running confirmed itself. The small, grim satisfaction of being right about something you'd hoped to be wrong about. Come into the study, she said. He spread the certified copies on the desk. She read through them in order methodically, completely, without interruption. When she finished, she went back to Edmund's letter and read it a second time. Then she sat back. He made a mistake, she said. Signing his name to a letter in a government registry, Nathaniel said. That too, she said. But the larger mistake is this. He filed the grant inquiry in February before the disputes existed. Which means when Crane's letter tries to cite the disputes as the basis for invoking the conditional clause, we can show that the inquiry predates the disputes. The disputes weren't the reason for the inquiry. They were manufactured to support an inquiry that already existed. She looked at him. That's not just evidence of Edmund's involvement. That's evidence of premeditation, of a coordinated plan to defraud. Can we prove that in a county proceeding? He said. We can prove it in front of the county magistrate with the certified copies in your hand, she said. The timeline is the proof. February inquiry, April filing, March departure of Simmons Harrow approached in April. It's all there in the dates. She paused. Edmund counted on the pieces being too far apart to connect. He didn't count on anyone looking at all of them at the same time. He didn't count on you, Nathaniel said. She met his eyes. He didn't count on us, she said. That word again. Us. She used it the way she used all her words precisely, meaning exactly what she said. And each time she said it, it meant something slightly more than it had the time before. He nodded. What do we do first? He said. We contact the county magistrate's office tomorrow morning, she said. Not a solicitor, directly to the magistrate. We present the certified copies and request a formal inquiry into Edmund's conduct and Crane's filing. We want this in official hands before Edmund has any indication we've been to Richmond. She paused. Does he know you went? I didn't tell anyone outside this household. Then we have perhaps 2 or 3 days before word travels, she said. That's enough time if we move tomorrow. He looked at her across the desk. I want to be clear about something, he said. She looked at him. Whatever happens with Edmund, with the proceeding, with the outcome, you are the reason this estate is still standing, he said. Not me, not my family name. You. He held her gaze. I want you to know I understand that. Not just as a matter of gratitude, as a matter of truth. She was quiet for a long moment. I want to be clear about something too, she said. When I came here I was prepared to do this work alone. I had accepted that was what my marriage would be. She paused. That is not what my marriage became. And the reason it became something different was not my effort alone. It was yours. Her voice was steady, but there was something in it. Something that had not been there in the early weeks. Something that had grown slowly, carefully, the way things grow that are meant to last. You changed, Nathaniel. Really changed. Not because you had to, because you decided to. He couldn't speak for a moment. You gave me a reason to trust this, she said. And I don't do that easily. I want you to know I understand the weight of what you did. In the quiet of the study, with the certified copies of Edmund's betrayal spread on the desk between them and the estate they had fought for together surrounding them on all sides, Nathaniel Caldwell looked at his wife and felt something he had spent 35 years teaching himself not to need. He felt clearly and without reservation that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Clara, he said. Nathaniel, she said, and he reached across the desk and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with declaration, simply reached across and took it. The way a man takes the hand of someone he has stopped pretending he can manage without, and she let him and her fingers closed around his with the particular steadiness that was the most essentially her thing about her. The quality that had been there on the church aisle, and in the kitchen garden, and in the county recorder's office, and in every moment between. Steady, choosing to stay, choosing him, not because he deserved it, because she had decided he was worth choosing, and Clara Whitmore Caldwell did not make decisions she didn't intend to keep. They sat like that for a moment. Then she squeezed his hand, once released it, and picked up her pen. We have a letter to draft to the magistrate's office, she said, and we should do it tonight while we have everything in front of us. He pulled his chair closer to the desk. Tell me how you want to begin, he said. She dipped her pen. With the date, she said, and then with the truth. He watched her write the first line, and he thought for the last time, he hoped with the particular ache of a man examining a mistake he can't undo, but has decided to build something better in the place of about 6 letters burning in a fireplace. He had lost 6 months. He had gained in the months since something he could not yet fully name, but intended to spend the rest of his life being worthy of. That would have to be enough. He picked up a second pen and began helping his wife write the document that would determine the future of everything they had built together. The letter to the magistrate's office went out before dawn. Clara had written the final version herself in the quiet hours after midnight, when Nathaniel had fallen asleep in the chair across from her desk, and she had let him sleep rather than wake him, because she had looked at his face in that unguarded moment and seen something she hadn't expected to see. Exhaustion. Yes, but beneath it, something softer. The face of a man who had finally put down a weight he'd been carrying so long, he'd stopped noticing it was there. She had written carefully, precisely. Every date documented, every connection drawn in plain language that required no legal interpretation to understand. The certified copies from Richmond were referenced and attached. The timeline she had constructed: February inquiry, March dismissal of Simmons, April filings, Harrow's account of the man named Martin, who'd approached him. Edmund's signed letter in the government registry was laid out with the clean logic of something that could not be argued with, only accepted. She sealed it before the household woke and gave it to the fastest rider on the estate, with instructions to have it in the magistrate's hands by mid-morning. Then she went to the kitchen, made coffee, and brought a cup to the study where Nathaniel was still sleeping. He woke when she set it on the desk. He looked at her, then at the window where the light was coming in, then at the empty space where the letter had been. You sent it, he said. An hour ago, she said. He sat up slowly. His hair was disheveled, and his coat was wrinkled, and he looked, she thought, considerably more human than he had on the morning she'd walked up the church aisle toward him. Better for it. You should have woken me, he said. You needed the sleep, she said. And the letter was finished. There was no reason to wake you. He looked at her for a moment, with that expression she had learned to read, the one that meant he was recalibrating, adjusting his understanding of something by a degree or two. He did it often now. She had stopped finding it surprising and started finding it one of the things she valued most about him. Thank you, he said. Drink your coffee, she said. We'll hear from the magistrate by afternoon. They heard from the magistrate by noon. The response came not by letter, but in person. A deputy from the magistrate's office, a young man named Carver, who arrived with the pressed efficiency of someone carrying an urgent message and delivered it to Nathaniel directly in the front hallway. Magistrate Hollis would receive them at 3 o'clock that afternoon. He had reviewed the documentation. He had questions. He expected both Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell to be present. Both. Clara noticed that. Nathaniel noticed her noticing it. He read the letter, he said. He understood who wrote it, she said. They arrived at the magistrate's office at 5 minutes before 3. Magistrate Hollis was a man of 60, with the dense, weathered solidity of someone who had spent decades making decisions in rooms where powerful people disagreed, and who had developed through that experience an absolute immunity to being impressed by names. He shook Nathaniel's hand, and then Clara's with equal weight, which told her something important about him. He had the certified copies spread on his desk when they sat down. "I'm going to be direct," he said, "because the documentation you've sent me is direct, and I appreciate that." He looked at both of them. "What you've described, if it holds up, is not a civil dispute. It is a coordinated criminal conspiracy to defraud the Caldwell estate through the manufacture of legal proceedings, the bribery or manipulation of third parties, and the attempted exploitation of a historical land grant's conditional clause." He paused. "That is a serious allegation." "We're aware," Nathaniel said. "The seriousness of the allegation is matched by the strength of the documentation," Clara said. "The Commonwealth's registry record is certified. Edmund Caldwell's letter is signed. The timeline is factual and verifiable." She paused. "We're not asking you to take our word for any of it. We're asking you to follow the evidence." Hollis looked at her. "You drafted this submission," he said. "We drafted it together," she said. He looked between them with the expression of a man who had learned over 60 years to read rooms accurately, and was reading this one with considerable attention. "I've been magistrate of this county for 19 years, he said. "I knew your father." This to Nathaniel. "I know the Caldwell name. I also know the estate has had a difficult several years." He set his hands flat on the desk. "What I did not know until this morning was that someone within the family had been systematically engineering that difficulty." He looked at the Edmund letter. "This signature is verified." "The registry clerk certified it," Nathaniel said. "I'll need to verify it independently," Hollis said. "Standard procedure. It will take 2 days." He looked up. "In those 2 days, does Edmund Caldwell have any reason to be alerted to what you've brought to me?" "Not from us," Nathaniel said. "Then I would ask you to keep this between the people in this room until I've completed my verification." Hollis sat back. "After that, we will need to discuss next steps. There are several parties involved. Crane Simmons, Edmund Caldwell, and the appropriate proceedings for each are different." "We understand," Clara said. "One more thing." He looked at her directly. "The grant inquiry that was filed in February, the one Crane initiated on your cousin's behalf. Once we establish the premeditated nature of the filing, we can move to have it formally invalidated. But that process requires a public proceeding. The county will need to understand what was done and how it was countered." He paused. "Are you prepared for that?" Clara looked at Nathaniel. He looked at her. "Yes," they said, together. Not rehearsed, simply the same answer arriving at the same moment from two people who had without ceremony or declaration arrived at the same place. Hollis nodded. "Then I'll be in contact in 2 days," he said. "Go home. Let me work." They drove back in the late afternoon, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. It was a different kind of silence than the ones that had populated their early weeks together. Not careful or managed or full of things being deliberately unsaid. This was the silence of two people who had said enough for the moment and were comfortable not filling the space. Then Nathaniel said, "When this is over." She looked at him. "When this is resolved," he said. "The estate stable, the proceedings concluded, everything settled." He looked at the road. "I want to go back to the beginning, or as close to it as we can get." "What does that mean?" she said. "I want to read your letters," he said. She was quiet. "I know they're gone," he said. "I know I burned them. I know there's no recovering them." He paused. "But I want you to tell me what you wrote, if you're willing." He glanced at her. "What you wrote about your gardens, your childhood, what you were hoping for when you sent them." She held his gaze for a moment. "You want to have the 6 months back," she said. "I want to earn having them back," he said. "There's a difference." She thought about this for a long time. Long enough that the carriage moved through 2 miles of road, and the light shifted, and a flock of birds crossed overhead, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with anything other than what it was. "All right," she said. "When this is over." The 2 days passed slowly and quickly. At the same time, the way days pass when you are waiting for something that matters. Nathaniel found himself unable to settle into his usual rhythms. The ledgers, the correspondence, the management of the estate's daily operations that had always organized his time with satisfying precision. He moved through the house restlessly, and Clara let him, and occasionally she handed him something useful to do. A letter to review, a calculation to check without making it obvious that she was managing his restlessness, which somehow made it more effective than if she had. On the second afternoon, she found him in the library, standing in front of the shelf where the estate's historical records were kept. "You're thinking about Edmund," she said. "I'm thinking about 35 years, he said. "Of dinners and letters and believing I knew who he was." He paused. "How do you do that? Carry something for 35 years that you had completely wrong." "The same way you carry anything," she said. "One day at a time. You don't carry 35 years all at once. You carry today." She came to stand beside him. "And today, Edmund is someone else's problem. Hollis is working. The documentation is in the right hands." She looked at him. "Today your job is to still be standing." He looked at her. "Is that how you managed it?" he said. "When you found out about the letters? When you came here knowing what kind of marriage you were walking into? One day at a time." "One morning at a time," she said. "Some days, that's as long as you can reasonably promise yourself." He was quiet. "I don't know how you did it," he said. "I had something to keep me busy," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved. The estate was in considerable disarray. He laughed. And again it came before he decided to the easy, unguarded kind that had been happening more frequently and that he had stopped trying to manage. She smiled. Fully this time. Not the small, contained version she'd worn through the early weeks, but something wider, more unguarded, more hers. He had not seen that smile before. He decided in that moment that he intended to see it as often as possible for the rest of his life. Hollis sent word on the third morning, not the second. A brief note saying that the verification had taken an extra day, but was complete, and asking them to come to the courthouse the following morning. Not his office this time. The courthouse. That distinction mattered. When they arrived, the courthouse anteroom held more people than they had expected. Gerald Pettit from the county recorder's office was there. Porter Harrow was there. He'd been asked to provide a sworn account of Simmons's approach. 2 additional men. Nathaniel didn't recognize who turned out to be investigators from the Commonwealth's attorney's office in Richmond, summoned by Hollis when the verification confirmed the scope of the conspiracy. And Edmund was there. Howe was seated in the corner with a solicitor. Nathaniel didn't recognize, not Crane, someone local. And when Nathaniel walked through the door, Edmund looked up. For a fraction of a second before he composed himself, Edmund's face did something Nathaniel would not forget. Not guilt exactly. Something flatter than guilt. The look of a man who has made a calculated bet and is watching the calculation fail and is already even in this moment trying to decide what story serves him best. Then it was gone, and Edmund was standing extending his hand saying, "Nathaniel, I heard there was some trouble with the estate. I came as soon as I could. Anything I can do to help?" "Sit down, Edmund," Nathaniel said. Not loud, not heated, flat and final the way you close a door. Edmund sat down. Clara beside Nathaniel said nothing. She didn't need to. She stood the way she had stood at the church altar with the particular grounded calm of someone who had already decided what they knew and had no need to perform uncertainty. Hollis called the proceeding to order. It was not a trial. Formal charges would come later through the appropriate criminal proceedings. This was a magistrate's inquiry, a formal examination of the documentation and sworn accounts to determine whether criminal referrals were warranted and to establish the official record of the attempted fraud. Harrow testified first. He described in plain and specific detail the man who had approached him in April, the man who had called himself Martin, who had known intimate details of the Caldwell estate's operations, who had told him the estate's management had been hiding financial irregularities and that a legal claim would be easy to win. Who had suggested the water rights angle specifically? Who had Harrow said with the particular candor of a man who had decided that his best position was absolute honesty, offered him a sum of money? If the claim succeeded a sum that came, he was told from a benefactor who had interests in the estate's future. Did this man describe the benefactor? Hollis asked. Not by name, Harrow said. He said it was a family member, someone who stood to benefit if the estate came under review. The room was very quiet. Edmund's solicitor murmured something to his client. Edmund's face was performing composure with visible effort. One of the Commonwealth investigators then presented the registry documentation, the February filing, the signed letter, the timeline. He laid it out methodically without drama, because documentation of this quality didn't need drama. It spoke in dates and signatures, and dates and signatures presented in sequence were more devastating than any rhetoric. Edmund's solicitor objected twice. Both objections were overruled. Then Hollis looked at Edmund. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "the letter bearing your signature filed with the Commonwealth's Land Registry in February of this year is in evidence before this proceeding. Do you dispute that the signature is yours?" Edmund looked at his solicitor. The solicitor gave a barely perceptible nod. "I do not dispute the signature," Edmund said. His voice was steady. "Give him that." "I dispute the interpretation being placed on the letter." "What interpretation do you offer?" Hollis said. "I was expressing a family member's genuine concern for the estate's management," Edmund said. "I had observed what I believed to be financial mismanagement over several years. I brought those concerns to the appropriate authority. That is not a crime." "The appropriate authority," Hollis repeated. "In February, before the disputes that form the basis of your expressed concern were filed." He looked at Edmund over the document. "The Granger boundary filing was made in April. The Harrow water claim was filed in May. Your letter expressing concern about legal irregularities was filed in February, 2 months before those irregularities existed." Edmund said nothing. How Hollis said with the patient precision of a man who has waited 19 years for exactly this kind of moment. "Did you know in February what the estate's legal situation would look like in April and May?" The silence that followed was one of the loudest things Nathaniel had ever experienced. Edmund's composure broke in a small specific way, not dramatically, not with the theatrical collapse of a villain in a stage production. Just a slight shift around the eyes, the look of a man whose calculation has run out of moves. "I'd like to consult with my solicitor," Edmund said. "You'll have the opportunity," Hollis said, "after this proceeding." He looked around the room. "The record of this inquiry will be forwarded to the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office in Richmond, based on the documentation presented and the testimony provided. I am finding sufficient grounds to refer for formal criminal investigation on charges, including conspiracy to defraud subornation of legal process, and given the involvement of a government filing made in bad faith. Potential charges related to the fraudulent use of the Commonwealth's registry." He looked at Edmund one last time. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "you are not under arrest at this moment, but I would strongly advise you not to leave the county." Edmund looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked back at him. He had thought about this moment, had rehearsed it in his mind on the long ride back from Richmond and in the sleepless hours since. He had imagined feeling rage. He had imagined feeling satisfaction. He had imagined the particular coldness of confronting someone who had used 35 years of family dinners and shared history as cover for deliberate betrayal. What he felt looking at his cousin across the room was grief. Not for Edmund, he was done extending sympathy in that direction. For the idea of Edmund. For the relationship he had believed he had that had never been real. For 35 years of a history that would now have to be understood differently. He looked away. Clara's hand found his arm. Not his hand. His arm, a steadying touch, brief and sure, and then withdrew. It was enough. The proceeding was adjourned. People began to move to speak in lowered voices to collect their documents and coats. Harrow stopped beside Nathaniel on his way to the door. "For what it's worth," Harrow said, "I'm sorry, for my part in it. I know sorry doesn't undo it." "No," Nathaniel said. "It doesn't." He looked at Harrow. "But you told the truth in there. That matters." Harrow nodded and left. Gerald Pettit from the recorder's office was next. He shook Nathaniel's hand, and then, with a deliberateness that was clearly intentional, shook Clara's. "The county is fortunate," Pettit said, looking at her, "to have someone paying attention." "We're both paying attention," Clara said. "That's how it works best." Pettit looked between them and smiled briefly professionally, and moved on. The two Commonwealth investigators spoke with Nathaniel for 20 minutes about the expected timeline of the formal proceedings, what would be required from the estate in terms of documentation, what they could expect by way of outcome. Clara stood beside him through all of it, answering half the questions, because she knew half the answers faster than he did, and because by now nobody in the room seemed to find this surprising. When the investigators left, they were alone in the anteroom. Everyone else had filtered out. The courthouse around them was settling into its afternoon quiet. Nathaniel looked at Clara. She looked back at him. "It's done," he said. "The beginning of done," she said. "The proceedings will take time." "I know," he said. "But the worst of it, the not knowing, the reacting, the being behind that's done." She considered this. Then she nodded. "Yes, that part is done." He took a slow breath. "How are you?" She looked at him with the slight surprise that his asking still occasionally produced. Not because she doubted the sincerity anymore, but because she was still, he suspected, adjusting to being asked. To having someone in the room who wanted to know the answer. She paused. "Relieved. And tired. And very ready to go home." "Home," he said, and the word had a different quality coming out of his mouth than it had ever had before. "Home," she confirmed. They drove back to Caldwell Manor in the late afternoon, and this time, neither of them was quiet for long. She told him about a letter she'd received that morning from her father, Charles Whitmore, who had heard rumors of the trouble and written to ask if they needed anything, which was so precisely her father that it made Nathaniel smile, because Charles Whitmore offering help, rather than extracting information, was the act of a man who had raised his daughter well. Nathaniel told her about a memory of Edmund, a hunting trip when they were young. Edmund laughing at something, a version of his cousin that no longer existed, and she listened without filling the silence after letting the grief have the space it needed. She was very good at that, letting things have the space they needed. He was learning to be. The estate looked different when they arrived, not materially, not in any visible way, but in the way that places look different when you've been away long enough to see them fresh. The main house, the garden. The fields in the distance where the eastern acreage was already beginning to show the results of the Resum tenancy. All of it there. All of it still standing. Still theirs. Benjamin was waiting at the door. He didn't ask questions. One look at their faces told him enough. He simply said, "I've had supper kept warm," and held the door. Inside the house settled around them with the particular warmth of a place that has been maintained while you were gone, where someone has kept the fires and lit the lamps and made sure that when you returned, the word home meant something specific and real. They ate supper together. The three of them. Nathaniel and Clara and Benjamin, which would have been unconventional by any standard of Virginia society in 1816, and which none of them mentioned because it was simply what made sense. Benjamin had been part of this fight as much as either of them. Pretending otherwise in the name of social form would have been an insult to everything the past months had been. Benjamin told them that Tom Greer had stopped by that afternoon to ask whether the eastern fence line repair was still approved. Clara said yes, and that they should also look at expanding the project to the north quarter fence before winter. Benjamin made a note. Nathaniel listened to the two of them talk about the estate's operations and felt for the first time that Caldwell Manor was not something he was managing alone. It had never been something one person should manage alone. He had simply been too proud to see that for most of his life. After supper, Benjamin retired. Clara remained at the table with her tea, and Nathaniel stayed across from her, and neither of them moved immediately toward the evening's tasks, because there weren't any. For the first time in months, the most urgent things had been handed to the appropriate authorities, and what remained was simply the ordinary business of a life. "Tell me about the gardens," he said. She looked up. "The letters," he said. "You said you wrote about your gardens." She held his gaze. "You said when this was over," she said. It's over enough. He nodded. She set down her tea. I had a kitchen garden, she said. At my father's house. I started it when I was 12. My mother thought it was peculiar. She said ladies grew flowers, not vegetables, and that getting soil under your fingernails was something you hired people for. A pause. I kept the garden anyway. I grew tomatoes and herbs, and one year I attempted squash, which was a disaster, but instructive. The corner of her mouth moved. I wrote about it in the second letter. I wrote that I had been thinking about what it would be like to have a kitchen garden at a new place, whether the soil would be different, whether I'd need to start from scratch, or whether there would already be something there worth keeping. There was, he said, worth keeping. I know that now, she said. What else? She looked at him. Something in her eyes had relaxed the last of the carefully maintained distance, the residual caution of a woman who had learned not to let things matter too quickly. It wasn't gone entirely, it was just resting, giving him room. In the fourth letter, she said, I wrote that I was frightened, not of you specifically, of what the marriage might become. I'd watched marriages, my parents, the marriages around them, and I had formed very clear ideas about what a woman risks when she gives her life to someone else's household. She paused. I wrote that I was hoping you were the kind of man who could surprise me, who could be more than what I expected. He was very still. Were you? She said. I hope so, he said. I'm still working on it. She nodded slowly. That, she said, is exactly the right answer. Outside, the night had settled fully over Harrow County, and Caldwell Manor was quiet, the way places are quiet when they've survived something and are resting on the other side of it. The fields were dark, the fences repaired, the records in order, the fraudulent claims dismissed, and the conspiracy in the hands of people equipped to dismantle it. The estate that had been slowly dying when Clara Whitmore had arrived was breathing, not easily, yet, not without effort, but steadily. With the determined resilience of something that has decided to keep going. In the weeks that followed, the formal proceedings moved with the methodical momentum of official machinery finding its stride. Edmund's solicitor attempted twice to negotiate a civil resolution that would circumvent the criminal referral. Both attempts were declined. Martin Simmons was located in Richmond through the address Harrow had provided and taken in for questioning. He cooperated with considerably more alacrity than anyone had expected, once he understood the scope of what was documented against him, which told Nathaniel everything about the depth of Simmons's conviction. He had been motivated by resentment and greed, not principle, and when principle-free motivations were removed from the equation, cooperation was generally the result. Aldous Crane withdrew from his representation of Edmund within a week of the courthouse proceeding, which was a professional calculation on Crane's part, and a practical one, since the Commonwealth's investigators had begun examining his role in filing the fraudulent grant inquiry. Whether Crane had known the inquiry was built on fabricated circumstances or had simply asked no questions he didn't want answered was a distinction the investigators would spend several months examining. The grant inquiry itself was formally invalidated in the third week, the conditional clause of the original 1771 document deemed inapplicable because the substantive disputes cited as its basis were demonstrated to have been manufactured rather than genuine. Gerald Pettit sent a formal notice of the invalidation to the estate and attached to it in what seemed like a personal addition to an otherwise official document, a handwritten note that said simply, "Well done." Clara pinned it to the wall of her working room beside the revised Harrow contract terms. The county talked as counties do. News of the Caldwell situation spread through Harrow County with the particular velocity of stories that contain everything people find compelling: betrayal, a family name, a conspiracy, and at the center of it, unexpected and almost improbable, a quiet woman who had arrived as an afterthought in someone else's arrangement and had turned out to be the thing that held the whole story together. People said things about Clara that filtered back to the estate through the permeable membrane of social communication. That she was sharp, that she was formidable, that she'd walked into a failing estate and found every thread worth pulling. That she was the best thing that had happened to the Caldwell name in a generation. Most of these things reached Nathaniel through Benjamin, who reported them with the careful neutrality of someone who found them entirely accurate and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. One particular account reached Nathaniel directly. Margaret Hartwell, 73. The woman who had laughed at the wedding reception. The woman who had survived 3 husbands and 40 years of Virginia society, and had opinions about everything. Sent a letter to the estate addressed to Clara, but written in its conclusion to Nathaniel as well. The final paragraph read, "I have observed a great many marriages in my lifetime. Mr. Caldwell and I have formed the view that most of them are what they were always going to be within the first 6 months. Yours is the exception. What you have made of it, both of you, is something considerably rarer than what most people manage. I hope you understand the value of what you have." He did. He was getting better at saying so. The public gathering happened in the 5th week, organized by the county's civic assembly as a formal acknowledgement of the fraud that had been attempted against the Caldwell estate and the manner in which it had been countered. It was not a celebration. Exactly. The criminal proceedings were ongoing, and celebration seemed premature. But it was a gathering of the county's principal families and civic figures, a public occasion. And Magistrate Hollis had asked Nathaniel to say a few words about what the past months had demonstrated. Nathaniel had thought about what he wanted to say for 3 days. He had written and discarded 4 drafts. Clara had read none of them. He hadn't shown them to her because this was something he needed to do himself. She had noticed the drafts existing because she noticed most things, and she had said nothing about them, which was exactly the right thing. He stood in front of the assembled county, the farmers and the landowners, the civic officials, the merchants, the families who had attended his wedding, and watched him stand at that altar with a woman he hadn't bothered to know. And he said what he had spent 3 days arriving at. "I inherited the Caldwell name," he said. "I have spent my life believing that what I inherited was the most important thing I had to protect. The name, the estate, the appearance of strength." He paused. "In the past several months I have been educated by events that didn't care about appearances, and by a person who never required them." He looked at Clara, who was seated to his left. She met his eyes with that direct, steady gaze, and she did not look away. "When my wife came to this estate," he said, "I had already decided who she was. I was completely wrong. She found in weeks everything I had failed to see in years. She protected with documentation and strategy and a kind of patient intelligence that I did not deserve an estate and a name that I had allowed to be placed at risk through my own inattention." He stopped. "I did not give her reason to do that. She did it because she is the kind of person who does what needs to be done without requiring the circumstances to be fair first. And I have spent the past several months trying to become someone worthy of working beside her." The room was very quiet. "What I want this county to understand," he said, "is that what saved the Caldwell estate was not my family name or my inheritance or anything I brought to this situation. What saved it was the person I was too proud to know for 6 months before I married her and too fortunate to have lost in the months after." He looked back at the room. "I am telling you this publicly because private acknowledgement is not the same thing. I had the privilege of being underestimated by every person who thought Clara Whitmore was a quiet, unimportant woman who would fit neatly into someone else's arrangement. I was among the worst offenders. The county should know what that cost me and what I had to earn back." He sat down. The applause that followed was not the polite, obligatory kind that social gatherings produce automatically. It was the surprised kind, the sound of a room that has heard something it didn't expect and is responding to the truth of it before the manners have time to curate the reaction. Clara did not applaud. She looked at him with that expression that she wore when she was feeling something she hadn't yet decided to name, and she held his gaze for a long moment, and then she turned to the room and acknowledged the assembled people with the quiet, undemonstrative dignity that was so essentially her that he could no more imagine her without it than he could imagine Caldwell Manor without its fields. Afterward, when the gathering had dispersed and the evening was settling over the county and they were in the carriage going home, she said nothing for a long time. Then, "You didn't show me those remarks." "No," he said. "They were yours to make," she said. "It was neither criticism nor approval. It was recognition." "Yes," he said. "Another mile of road." "You said public acknowledgement," she said. "Yes," he said. "Why does it matter that it's public?" He considered this the real answer, not the diplomatic one. Because you were dismissed publicly, he said. By me and by the assumptions people carried about who you were before they knew you. The correction needed to be public too. Private apologies fix private hurts. This was bigger than private. She looked at him for a long moment. That, she said carefully, is the most precisely right thing you have ever said to me. He felt the warmth of that land somewhere near the center of his chest and stay there. I thought about the 6 months he had spent deciding she was unimportant. About the letters burning in the fireplace before the wedding. About the arrogance of a man who had built his entire life on the assumption that the world would organize itself according to his expectations, and had only discovered the error of that assumption when a quiet woman arrived in his house with a notebook and started asking questions he should have been asking for years. I thought about every morning since the kitchen garden, the records room, the county recorder's office, the Richmond registry, the courthouse, the sitting room late at night when they had built something between them that hadn't existed before and couldn't be replicated because it was made of exactly the combination of people they both were, and no substitution would have produced the same thing. He reached over and took her hand. She let him. Her fingers closed around his, the same way they had in the study, with the particular unperformative steadiness that was the most Clara thing about her. The quality that had been there from the first moment, and would be there, he understood now every moment after. "Tell me about the squash," he said. She looked at him. "The squash that was a disaster," he said. "When you were 12. You said it was instructive." She looked at him for another moment, that soft, considering look that he loved, that he was only now giving himself permission to call love without qualification. And then she began to tell him. He listened to every word. I intended to listen from this morning forward to every word she said, and every word she didn't say, and every silence between them, because the cost of not listening was something he had paid once and would not pay again. And the reward of listening, of genuinely carefully, completely attending to the person beside him, was the thing he had almost thrown away before he understood what it was. Caldwell Manor came into view ahead of them. The lights were on. Benjamin kept the lights on when they were out in the evenings, a small, consistent act of welcome that Nathaniel had never thought to ask him to do, and that Benjamin had simply done for years, because he understood what coming home was supposed to feel like even when the people coming home had forgotten. The estate was not what it had been when Clara arrived. The fields were in better order. The contracts were fair. The workers had housing that didn't leak and a line of communication that reached all the way to the house. The records were organized. The fraudulent claims were dismissed. The conspiracy was in official hands, and the grant that had stood for 45 years would stand for 45 more. And inside the house, in the working room, where the Harrow contract terms and Pettit's handwritten note were pinned to the wall, and in the kitchen garden, where the soil was dark and the rows were practical, and in the study where 2 pens had written a document that changed everything, and in the sitting room, where a nightbird had called once and gone quiet, while 2 people sat with something they hadn't yet named, and both of them knew it. In all of those places, something had taken root that was stronger than the original grant, stronger than the family name, stronger than anything inherited or assumed or carried through generations without examination. It was the thing that 2 people build when they stop managing each other and start seeing each other. It was the thing Clara had told him he would have to earn. He had earned it. Not perfectly, not easily, not without cost, but truly with every choice made since the morning he had first walked into the kitchen garden and said her name and asked a question he should have asked 6 months earlier, and she had risen from the earth with soil on her hands and answered him without pretense, and everything that had been rigid in him had started slowly to learn something different. The carriage stopped. Nathaniel stepped down and turned and offered his hand. Clara took it and stepped down beside him, and they stood together for a moment in front of the house that was theirs. Not his, not hers, but genuinely, equally, irreversibly theirs, and then they walked inside. The door closed behind them. That was how it ended, and how it began, and how it became the kind of story that Harrow County would tell for generations. Not because it was spectacular, but because it was true. The story of a proud man who had to be taught how to see, and a quiet woman who had always known what she was worth, and waited with extraordinary patience for the world to catch up. She never needed anyone's permission to be exactly who she was. That was the whole of it.